Advisory Committee meeting. Thank you guys for joining. I am Loretta Melby. I'm the board's executive officer, and I will be kind of managing this meeting. And then the next meeting, we will have a chair and a vice chair that is appointed today after we get to those agenda items. So the first thing that I'm going to do is introductions. And so I see that we have our board's legal counsel, Reza Pejahesh, on. You want to say anything?
Good morning. This is Reza. I'm the RN's legal counsel. I've got a presentation a little later this morning, so I'll just state my introduction and wait till then.
Wonderful, thank you. And then Sandra, are you able to unmute?
Everyone, I'm Sandra Bordy. I'm a CRNA. I've been a CRNA for 21 years. I work for Kaiser Permanente School of Anesthesia. I'm an academic and clinical instructor, and I still practice anesthesia at an urban Kaiser hospital. So thank you for allowing this opportunity to be here. So I look forward to a really prosperous meeting and a prosperous year, actually. So thank you.
Thank you. We'll go to Karen next.
Hi, everyone. I'm Karen Karp. I'm past president of CANA. I'm past director of the practice division. I currently practice at San Joaquin General Hospital, which is a level 2 trauma center, county in Stockton. And I'm delighted to be here. So I'm looking forward to working with everyone.
Thank you. And Joseph or Joe, what do you prefer?
Joe Martin. I prefer Joe. I answer to both. CRNA, live in Fresno, California. I'm the program director at National University. I don't know if you guys can see you can't. 1 second. See, my video's off. Program director at National University in Fresno, California, where we have a CRNA residency program, DNAP program. Also, I'm the owner and CEO of Valley Regional Anesthesia Associates. We service hospitals and surgery centers throughout the state of California, Nevada, now Washington and Arizona. Delighted to be here and work with you guys. Excited to see the practice of CRNAs expanded in the state of California. Recently, on the private side, just took over in Stanislaus County Hospital, Doctors Hospital of Modesto, Medical Center in Modesto. It was all physician practice for the last 30 plus years. And we've instituted CRNAs in there, and the word on the street in the hospital is that the best anesthesia provider in that whole hospital is a CRNA. And they went to our university, National. So excited to see more of that for our state.
Fantastic, thank you. And I'll try to remember Joe instead of Joseph. We'll go to Samantha.
That's awesome, Joe. I'm Samantha. I live in San Diego, originally from Boston. I moved here about 2 years ago. Back in Boston at Tufts. And then since I moved to San Diego, I've started my own anesthesia group out here. Primarily, I'm also working a little bit.
I don't know am I the only one hearing audio?
No, it's glitchy.
In and out as well, yeah.
Okay, it might be
Samantha, sorry, and some I didn't.
Can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
This
Yes.
meeting is being recorded.
1 second.
Coming across really clear right now.
How about now?
Yeah, we're able to hear you.
Okay.
Yep.
I think it was the earpods. Do you want me to start over?
That would be great. That way we're recording
Okay.
and we can hear the full introduction.
Okay. So I started by saying congratulations, Joe. That's really awesome to hear. I think that's a big step for us. But myself, I'm Samantha. You can call me Sam. I'm originally from Boston. I was practicing out there for 8 years before moving here about 2 years ago. That part of my practice was in the academic setting at Tufts Medical Center, where I was mostly on the cardiac anesthesia team. Then when I moved here, I kind of did a 180 and started working in the outpatient surgery centers, 1099, and began forming my own anesthesia group that's small and growing. So I'm learning a lot and really enjoying it. And through that experience, I'm really trying to promote autonomy and independence among the CRNAs down here in San Diego and overall. But that's pretty much it.
Okay, thank you, Sam. And the next one would be Kathleen.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Kathleen Theobald. I am the Executive Director for the Kaiser Permanente Nurse Anesthetist Association. I am not a CRNA. I am not clinical at all. However, I've been representing CRNAs throughout Southern California and on a national level within Kaiser Permanente since 2010. Negotiate all of their contracts, represent them in any practice or grievance hearings. And it's been the honor of my life to work with this amazing group of individuals and be a part of and watch all of the change of the CRNA practice in California since 2010, which has been, an extreme change since when I first came on board. And it's been a roller coaster ride, and I see it's going to continue to be a roller coaster ride, but as I like to tell my people, time is on our side, and it's a great time to be a CRNA. So thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Just a quick ask for those of you who have cameras and are able to remain on video. If you would do so, we'll get into why in my presentation. It's a new legal requirement. If you're having technical difficulties, that's kind of the only reason that there's an excuse. But again, more on that later. But just for now, if you have that ability, please do.
I'm having technical difficulties. This is Karen Karp. So sorry.
No worries. Thanks, Karen.
Okay, thank you. So that was roll call, and that was establishing a quorum as well. So we will move to the format and continue technical difficulties too, in a sense. So we'll turn it over to board moderator.
I don't know, Loretta, if that was you. I wasn't able to hear most of that. I don't know if anybody else had a problem hearing that.
I did as well. I think she was just saying she might have been having technical difficulties as well, and she handed it off to our board moderator to move to the next agenda item.
Good morning. This is the BRN moderator. I will be moderating the meeting. To facilitate public comment, we will be utilizing the WebEx question and answer feature. When the committee reaches a point in the agenda at which public comment is appropriate, the question and answer feature will be turned on, and members of the public can indicate that they would like to make a comment by inserting the phrase, "I would like to make a comment," in the question box, which is typically in the lower right of your screen. We will also query our physical location. I will then call on that individual and unmute their microphone. The individual will have 2 minutes to make their comments. I will not give a warning as your time approaches. I will mute your microphone and will announce that your time has exceeded the time allotted. I will then proceed to the next member of the public who has a comment. Please note that the question and answer feature is being used only as a means for members of the public to represent that they would like to make a verbal comment. When your turn comes, you will be prompted to unmute. If your question can be answered by the committee, if your question can be answered, the committee will respond accordingly. When making your comment, speak about anything you believe is important for the members to know. Remember, committee members cannot address any item not on the agenda. Items not on the agenda at that moment, or items that you would like to add to a future meeting, will be discussed later on in the agenda, will be discussed at their correct times during the meeting. I will provide a brief reminder of this approach at the start of each public comment item. Finally, when committee members or BRN staff are not speaking, I would like to remind them to mute their microphone. If I detect background noise during the meeting as a result of unmuted microphones, I will mute your microphone automatically.
Thank you, Mark. I'm gonna have to talk to our IT guy. No, I'm joking. I'll be able to get this troubleshooted. I just probably have to do a restart, but I'll switch to my phone prior to that happening. So we have discussed the process for public items for public comments for items not on the agenda. And so we'll go ahead and open it up to public comments for items not on the agenda. What the committee can do at this point is if somebody brings up a topic that is not on the agenda, they would make a vote to add it to a future agenda, or you can choose just to kind of take it in and we can't really respond, but just kind of note it. So thank you for that. And board moderator, we'll have you open up to public comments for items not on the agenda, please.
We will be opening for public comment now. Please refer to the screen share for members of the public to see how they should type in their request for comment. I've activated the question and answer feature. Members of the public can indicate that they would like to make a comment by typing into the question box, "I would like to make a comment." Please remember, you will have 2 minutes to make your comments. I will not give a reminder as your time approaches. I do not want to interrupt you nor cause you to lose your train of thought. I will mute your microphone and inform you that your time has expired and will move on to the next member of the public. I'll pause for a moment for members of the public to type in, "I would like to make a comment."
For members to type in, I will let you know that we do not have public comments here in Sacramento.
Thank you. Board EO Melby, there are no public requests for comments in the WebEx. There are no public requests for comments at the location. Would you like me to close this window?
Yes, please. Okay, so we'll go into item 4.0. It is information only. This is the advisory committee member training. So there will be a lot of kind of information giving. Please use this as a time for discussion and with questions and answers so that you guys are clear on your role moving forward. And so we will open it up with 4.1, roles and responsibilities for board members, staff, CRNA, AC members, and meeting etiquette. So I'm still troubleshooting. I apologize. I wish I would have had this up and known that this was going to occur earlier. So with this, I know that we added this as a vote, but our board members did. It came about because we did have a APRN committee. That APRN committee was kind of recommended to us via the legislator so that we can get feedback from all 4 APRN specialties. What occurred is it was formed and it made a lot of progress, but then we did get the SB 1237 and AB 890, 2 big, pretty pivotal bills that went through that established a separate nurse midwife committee and a separate nurse practitioner committee. So with the APRN committee at that point, they had to refocus, and they refocused on just the nurse anesthetist and the clinical nurse specialist. As that was happening and kind of going through that process, we really realized that there needed to be a more focused group on each one and not have it a shared meeting. And so that there wasn't any overlap, and so that the processes that needed to be addressed and updated could move in a more expedited manner. So with that, our board did choose to sunset the APRN committee and or not but start up the Certified Registered Nurse Anesthetist Advisory Committee, as well as the Clinical Nurse Specialist Advisory Committee. In doing so, we did move the members from the APRN committee over to our new committees. And so we do have some people involved in each one of the committees that do have some knowledge of how meetings go and how they can be directed. And so that is a positive. So not everybody is absolutely brand new, but even for those that are not brand new, it's always good to have a refresh. So today I will facilitate the meeting, but in the future, the facilitation of the meeting goes to the chair that is elected. That chair will operate in that role. We do an annual reappointment of chairs and vice chairs. If the chair is ever not able to work with the committee or is not able to be in attendance, then it will go to the vice chair to facilitate the board meetings. Both the chair and the vice chair do collaborate with me as the executive officer, as well as Macaulay Fusarins, our chief of licensing, who has been granted the advisory committee liaison role until we can get that better aligned. And our board's legal counsel, Reza Pejou, has as well, typically joins those meetings. We'll have discussions about establishing agendas at that point, what the goals are of the CRNAAC meetings, and really work to kind of make sure that items that need to be addressed are being addressed. Sometimes that does cause a little redirection because the board has a limited jurisdiction. And our advisory committees are made to give recommendation to our board. And if it's not under our board's jurisdiction, then we typically say, oh, that's with CDPH, or that's under Title 22, or that's with CMS, and that's billing. And we can't really bring it up and have discussions where the board can make motions at that. So then we will redirect at that point. What we will aim to produce from those meetings is if there are items that we are not able to bring forward to an agenda, we will make mention of those on our web and show where those need to be followed up, because that seems to be a disconnect in where that follow-up needs to occur. And I know that there are a lot of people that typically wait for our advisory committee meetings to hear about those items that they brought forward, even though they can't be discussed with us. And so they think that maybe we were ignoring or not putting them forward. And so truly that's not the fact, not the reason. It's just it's not under our jurisdiction. When we discuss matters here and it goes to this one's information only, we'll actually get to the point, and I'll say, since this was information only, no vote is needed, we will go on to public comment. If a vote is needed, the only people that are able to vote are the members of the committee. I am not a voting member. Reza is not a voting member. If Macaulay is elevated as she is today, she is not a voting member. It is just the 4 nurse anesthetists as well as the 1 public member that will vote on anything to move forward. When you do vote to move forward, if it is an item that can be managed by board staff, then it's just a vote that, board staff will manage this, et cetera, and we'll kind of work with that. But if it is an item that needs to go forward to the board, we will work with you on specific language with that, where you will say that, such as the Nurse Anesthetist Advisory Committee recommends that this go, make a motion that we recommend that this go forward to the board for discussion on such and such. And then your recommendations from this committee as a whole goes forward. We do share the meeting minutes, so they do know what individual members kind of talk about as they're preparing for that agenda item. But the individual members' votes, that's not necessarily what's taken into consideration. It's what the committee votes as a whole that really gets taken into consideration. And then understanding that that is just advisement to the board, that our board can choose to make a choose to follow that advisement, or they can choose to alter that in any way as well. Then with that, you do have a huge workload that we're hoping that you guys address. I'm sure that you guys have noticed that there hasn't been a lot of movement in CRNA rules and regulations. And so we really hope that at least this first year, probably 2 years, we'll go into that process and those be shared on other agenda items moving forward. I will turn this over right now to Reza and see if he has anything to add or clarify, as I was trying to juggle back and forth, working on my technical issues and trying to continue to stay focused, but I felt like a little squirrel with ADD at that point. So I want to make sure that Reza manages that up and see if there's anything more that he needs to clarify, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers. And while Reza does that, I'm going to continue to troubleshoot.
I don't have a whole lot to add. I will be going into my presentation on a couple of legal topics, one of which will focus on how we conduct meetings and things, and maybe answer some questions about kind of why things are structured the way they are during our meetings. Before that, I just wanted to add that the statutes in the Nursing Practice Act regarding nurse anesthetists do kind of create some room for the board to create regulations. And you will be also getting a presentation about the rulemaking process by which regulations are passed. And so let me take a look at the materials here. I believe that was identified in the materials, the statute that I have in, is it? Okay.
Agenda item, yeah.
You mean in this agenda?
I thought it was the next one.
Yeah, it's okay. Bear with me here.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, so the statute that I had in mind, it's identified in the meeting materials, specifically in the charter document for this committee, and that's Business and Professions Code section 2826. In the charter, it states that this committee will focus on that section and make recommendations to the board, specifically section 2826 subdivision A states that it defines a nurse anesthetist, and it states in the certification and recertification process, the board shall consider the standards of the National Board of Certification and Recertification for Nurse Anesthetists or a successor national professional organization approved by the board, and may develop new standards if there is a public safety need for standards more stringent than the council's standards. In determining the adequacy for public safety of the council's standards or in developing board standards, the board shall comply with the provisions of Chapter 3, ... That Chapter 3.5 that I was referring to and that I just mentioned, that's the part of the government code that identifies, that spells out the rulemaking process. You'll get a lot of information on that. That process is detailed. It can be lengthy, with the intention of really fleshing out good policy. But what I just read there, again, that's one specific area within our statutes where the legislature has kind of specifically called out an area where the board might implement regulations. It's not necessarily required because it does allow the board to utilize the standards of the National Board of Certification or a successor national organization. But if the board wanted to implement more stringent standards or go above and beyond what those standards require, that's where the regulations would come into play. And that's, of course, where the expertise of this group and the work that you're going to be doing will come into play. Now, you're not just limited to that, but that is one area where definitely it will be worthwhile for this committee to really dig in deep and consider whether there ought to be additional standards. So hope that helps. Other than that, I didn't have a whole lot to add here, other than stay tuned till I come on later, unless we're done with your item, Lori, and you want me to dive into mine.
Not quite done yet. I wanted to make sure that they have a chance to ask any questions and get any answers at this point before we move forward.
And maybe public comment. Any questions from committee members at this point?
Okay, perfect. We'll go ahead and open it up to public comment, please.
We will be opening for public comment now. Please refer to the screen share for members of the public to see how they should type in their request for comment. I've activated the question and answer feature. Members of the public can indicate they would like to make a comment by typing into the question box, "I would like to make a comment." Please remember, you will have 2 minutes to make your comments. I will not give you reminders as time approaches. I do not want to interrupt you nor cause you to lose your train of thought. I will mute your microphone and inform you that your time has expired, and we'll move on to the next member of the public. I'll pause for a moment for members of the public to type in, "I would like to make a comment."
And while we give a moment for that to take place, something just popped into my mind I did want to mention. And you may get more on this later, but I wanted to emphasize really the board's overall mission and kind of distinguish that from other concerns. The board is tasked with public protection. So there may be times where, there we go. I see we have it on the screen. The board's mission, I'll read it real quick. The mission of the California Board of Registered Nursing is to protect the health, safety, and well-being of the public through the fair and consistent application of the statutes and regulations governing nursing practice and education in California. The board values include effectiveness, integrity, transparency, collaboration, and equity. So again, emphasizing, and apart from the board's mission that you see on the screen here, it's also stated in statute in the Nursing Practice Act. The legislature has tasked the Board of Registered Nursing, as well as all the other professional regulation boards within the Department of Consumer Affairs, with the priority of public protection. And that'll come up from time to time. You may, hear me or Lori reminding you of that, because there's a lot of voices with a lot of things to say about nursing and about certified registered nurse anesthetists and about the practice, etc. Our lens that we look through with the board and through this committee, because your task is to advise the board, is public protection. There may be times where, for example, the advancement of the profession, it goes hand in hand with public protection. There may be other situations where those are not necessarily aligned in exactly the same way, and where they're not necessarily aligned, you have to kind of put on your Board of Registered Nursing thinking hat, if you will, and make sure you're kind of considering first and foremost that public protection. So it's not that that the board and this committee is anti-CRNA. It's that's not it at all, but it is pro public. So hopefully that makes sense. Usually, those things are not drastically in conflict. So it's only from time to time that we have to remind you of that. But I do want you to keep that in the back of your mind. There are other groups that represent the profession itself, the nurses associations, the CRNA associations, those professional associations, their main focus is advancement of the profession. And they likewise may also, be advancing public protection. But again, we have our slightly different priority. So that's the one thing I wanted to mention. Thank you.
Board EO Melby, there are no public requests on the WebEx. Do we have any public requests at BRNHQ? Thank you. Would you like me to close this window?
Yes, please. And Reza, can I ask you to kind of go into the next agenda item for me? I'm still having some issues and I'm waiting for my computer to restart.
The next agenda item, 4.2, I'm going to be talking about the Bagley-Keene Open Meeting Act, quorum, voting, and the Public Records Act. I've got some slides that I'm going to put up on screen, so bear with me. And moderator, if you'd mind, I don't know if I need you to take the slides down to make way for mine, but I'm going to go ahead and share mine here.
I have a quick question while we're waiting. Will we be getting copies of your presentations?
Yes, Macaulay, if you're there. If it's not,
presentation will be posted after this meeting.
okay, it'll be posted the same page on the website where the meeting agenda and the other materials are.
Yes.
Great. Okay. Can you confirm, is my slide?
We can see your slide, Reza. Is there any way you can make it bigger? A little small.
There is the ability on WebEx to pop that out, and then you do have control in the WebEx form to do a plus or a minus. Is typically on the kind of towards the top of your screen, and so anytime that there are slides or any presenters going on the screen, you can make it bigger or smaller on your computer as well. Yeah, I just heard from Reza that WebEx kicked him out and he is logging back in too. This is the way the first meetings always go. It's always to test our patience. So bear with us as Reza is logging back on. My computer is now up, and so I should be joining by computer now too, and I'll be off my phone soon as well. And true to form that misery loves company, I'm glad it's not just my computer. It might just be WebEx. So we'll get this worked out and we'll be there and move forward as soon as possible.
I'm sorry about that. As soon as I shared my slide, I got a window that said WebEx is not responding. I apologize. Bear with me. It's not always this rough. But just give me another moment to get my slides up. I think when I was trying to zoom in, something went wrong.
real quick, Mark, I'm able to get my camera up and going right now. It's working pretty well. Can you make sure that my audio is coming through too?
And smooth.
We're good to go. I'm so excited. Thank you.
Okay. Are you able to see my slide? I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to make it any bigger on my end. I'm just afraid of messing something up.
Yeah, we're able to see your slide, and just to reiterate again, and you probably didn't hear it while you were getting kicked out of the webinar and back on. Underneath, if you have it set up in a layout mode on your WebEx, underneath that there is a plus and a minus, and it says viewing Reza BRN Legal Counsel's screen. There's a plus and a minus. Mine's at 75% just because I have multiple things up on my screen. But you can zoom that in and make it as large as you need it to be for you to view. There is also an ability to pop that out and make it a separate screen if you have multiple screens up, or a large display. So hopefully that is helpful for you. Reza, go ahead, and I will mute and stay on camera, and we'll go ahead and let you go on with your presentation. Thank you guys for your patience this morning. I think we're getting there.
Yes, thank you again for bearing with me. Again, I think the slides will be distributed, so you'll have a chance to, for what it's worth, have these. So I'll be talking again about the Bagley-Keene Open Meeting Act and the California Public Records Act. The Bagley-Keene Open Meeting Act, we often refer to it as just Bagley-Keene or just the Open Meeting Act, or maybe the OMA. That's, again, going to answer some questions about some of the kind of quirky ways that we conduct these meetings and why it's done in that way. The Public Records Act, again, it's important. These are a couple of things that are very important for all of our committee members, board members to be pretty well familiar with. Diving into the Bagley-Keene Open Meeting Act, the statutory sections are identified on the screen. It's Government Code Section 11120 is where it starts. If you download these slides, you can click on the hyperlink there, and that should take you to the full text of the Bagley-Keene Open Meeting Act, which I would encourage you to give a read at least once to the entire act. My presentation, I should say, is not going to cover every last detail. It'll cover the most important things for you all to be aware of. So it doesn't hurt to go through the act one time just to see what else is in there. But I'm going to do my best to give you the key points that you need to be most aware of. So you may have noticed already, and for those of you who've been with us for longer, or maybe have past experience with government boards, or have just tuned in to some of our board meetings, etc., you may have noticed that there's kind of a formalistic way of doing things. Even in this meeting, we opened up with public comment for items not on the agenda. We took public comment on agenda items so far, even though we might not have necessarily expected public comment. So you may have already started to notice that there are some formalities to the way we conduct these meetings. So at a high level, the Bagley-Keene Open Meeting Act requires that discussions, deliberations, and action taken by, quote, state bodies be conducted in public meetings that abide by established requirements. And we'll dive in a little more detail into, what is a state body and what is a, quote, meeting, and what are the requirements for that. Under the Open Meeting Act, there is limited authority, and I emphasize limited authority, for certain portions of meetings to be conducted in closed session only if there is specific statutory authority that says that that type of discussion can be in closed session. I really don't anticipate that this committee will have hardly anything to discuss in closed session. Closed session, by the way, is where it's just committee members and myself and maybe staff present, but no members of the public. Apart from that, everything is done in open session where members of the public are privy to listen in and make public comment at the appropriate times. I really don't foresee much for this committee to do in closed session, just because there's not really statutory authority for the types of things that you're probably going to be talking about. So I'm not going to read, by the way, let me take a step back. Throughout my slides, you'll see probably quite a bit of actual statutory text. That's just maybe it's being an attorney, just my preference to give you the source of the law. And so you know it's not just me saying it or, board staff telling you things. I may or may not read all of it because it's not always in this format, not always worthwhile to go through every word. But here I'm going to read just a couple of provisions, which you see underlined there. And this is really giving you kind of the spirit of the Open Meeting Act and why it is the way it is. So reading here from the underlined portions, and this is, again, in statute in the Open Meeting Act, quote, "It is the intent of the law that actions of state agencies be taken openly and that their deliberation be conducted openly. And the people insist on remaining informed so that they may retain control over the instruments that they have created." End quote. So that gives you kind of the gist of what the legislature has in mind in making us kind of jump through these hoops when we get together to discuss anything related to CRNA practice, etc. So there is an inherent trade-off. On the one hand, what you might be used to in your personal business, in that context, you would definitely be looking to having efficiency and flexibility in conducting your business. On the other hand, what the Open Meeting Act prioritizes is transparency to the public, opportunities for stakeholder input, public participation, etc. The reason I say it's a trade-off and that the Open Meeting Act kind of favors the latter is that some of the, again, I'm calling them hoops that we have to jump through, do inherently slow things down a bit. They do make it a little more cumbersome to conduct business and conduct discussions, but it is that way for a reason. So the fundamental, again, a little more on the high level premise behind the Open Meeting Act, and these I will read, quote, "All meetings of a state body shall be open and public, and all persons shall be permitted to attend any meeting of a state body except as otherwise provided in this article." And quote, "A majority of the members of a state body shall not, outside of a meeting authorized by this chapter, use a series of communications of any kind, directly or through intermediaries, to discuss, deliberate, or take action on any item of business that is within the subject matter of the state body." So breaking that down just a bit, a couple things. One, emphasizing that language in the second quote that says to discuss, deliberate or take action on any item of business that is within the subject matter of the state body. So first of all, within the subject matter of the state body, this committee's subject matter jurisdiction is certified registered nurse anesthetists and the practice and education and regulation of that profession. So outside of one of these public meetings, you're not supposed to be communicating with your other committee members about that. So, if you were to talk about the football game over the weekend, that's obviously outside of the jurisdiction of this committee. But anything related to the jurisdiction of this committee is really supposed to be discussed in these public meetings, again, so that the public is aware of your discussions and that they have an opportunity to provide additional input. And those are good things. The other thing I want to emphasize here is it refers to a series of communications of any kind directly or through intermediaries. So the obvious type of communication that's prohibited is you all getting together in a meeting that's not public and discussing it, or you calling one of your other committee members, or discussing something outside of one of these meetings directly. That's pretty obvious. But a communication can occur in violation of the Open Meeting Act if it were through an intermediary and it was a series of communications. For example, if one of you were to send me an email and say, hey, these are my thoughts on this particular issue regarding nurse anesthetists, and then I forward that out to the other committee members, that's a communication that's taking place through an intermediary, me in that case, but still reaching the other committee members. So that type of thing is also prohibited. So just be mindful that it's pretty broad prohibition here that restricts your communications. The goal is really to have everything that you discuss regarding CRNA regulation take place in these public meetings. So I'm not going to read this full thing, but this is just citing the statute that defines what is a state body. So of course, the Board of Registered Nursing is a, quote, state body. Individual committees that the board creates are likewise state bodies. This committee falls under subdivision C of this section because it's an advisory committee of a state body that was created by formal action of the Board of Registered Nursing. And then you'll notice at the end of that underlined passage that it refers to, that it says, if the advisory body so created consists of 3 or more persons. So this committee there's 5 of you, so obviously you do fall under that definition, and you are therefore a, quote, state body, and so you are subject to all of the requirements of the Open Meeting Act, including, like we just talked about, having all of your discussions take place in these public meetings. But one thing that we actually will be talking about a little bit later in this agenda is subcommittees. And so I want to pause and highlight that piece here that talks about 3 or more persons to kind of help you understand later when we're talking about subcommittees why we're structuring them the way that we do. So again, the overall premise is that your discussions have to take place in these meetings. These meetings are scheduled every so often. There's a lot of work that goes into coordinating, and of course, you all set aside your valuable time to do this. So a lot goes into having these meetings, and it can't be, technically it could be as often as you want to schedule them, but practically, logistically, there's a limitation on how often these things can happen. So in order to allow for some work to be done in between meetings, oftentimes the board and our committees will form subcommittees of 2 committee members. And by having it limited to 2 committee members, we don't trigger this definition that refers to an advisory body of 3 or more persons. A 2-member subcommittee is not, quote, a separate state body that was created by formal action of a board or committee. So those 2-member subcommittees are not subject to having public meetings and doing things in the same way that we're doing it today. That allows that 2-member subcommittee to meet and discuss things offline in between these public meetings, and allow for, they can talk to other stakeholders offline. They can talk amongst each other offline and put together, some information or whatever it may be that they're tasked with doing in between these meetings, and then come to the subsequent committee meeting of the full committee and report to the committee and get further input from the committee for the direction, etc. It's just a way to allow work to continue to progress offline. And it's you can call it a loophole if you want, but it's not with the intention of shielding anything from the public eye. It's really with the intention of allowing work to continue within the confines of what the Open Meeting Act allows. And again, whatever the subcommittees do is always brought back to the full committee and reported out. So it's, again, it's not with the intent of kind of veiling anything in secrecy. We'll talk more about that on a agenda item coming up a little bit later. So the definition of meeting is what we're talking about on this slide. As used in this article, meeting includes any congregation of a majority of the members of a state body at the same time and place to hear, discuss, or deliberate upon any item that is within the subject matter jurisdiction of the state body to which it pertains. So what I want to emphasize here is that phrase that's underlined, hear, discuss, is construed pretty broadly. And if you were, communicating with other committee members offline outside of these meetings, it's pretty easy to trip up and trigger a violation. Obviously, discuss, deliberate, that's pretty obvious what that means, and that's something that's pretty easy to avoid doing outside of these meetings. But also here, that's one that's a little easier to kind of trip up and maybe inadvertently run into a violation. Going so far as social media, if you were to post something and you've got your other committee members within your social media group and you were to, talk about what the regulation standards could be, arguably that's something that could fall under this definition. So just be mindful, be careful about it. Ultimately, taking a step back, if you do have questions about the Open Meeting Act, of course, you can interrupt me now if you have questions. I've got time reserved at the end of my presentation for questions and answers. And then beyond that, outside of these meetings, if questions arise, if you're uncertain about whether you can have a certain communication or whether a certain communication might have been problematic, you do have avenues. You can reach out to your staff liaison, who, if it's a legal question, would probably flip it to me, or you can always get my contact information and reach out to me directly. That's also fine. So just wanted to take a step back and let you know that if you do have questions or concerns outside of this meeting, you've got us as a resource. So action taken. I'm not going to read this, but I just want to emphasize here again that, generally action taken by this committee is going to refer to a motion that's made in one of these meetings to recommend something to the board or something along those lines. But it's usually going to involve a motion and a vote of the committee. That's how formal action is done by state bodies. But just reminding you that outside of these meetings, you're not just limited to, it's not just that you can't take action outside of a public meeting. Like we discussed previously, you're prohibited from, quote, hearing, discussing, or deliberating outside of these meetings. So again, just keep that in mind and err on the side of caution. And if you have questions or concerns, feel free to raise them up. So this next few slides is really going to be the heart, I think, of the presentation and what you need to take away, apart from what we just said about what you can't do outside of meetings. So what is a, quote, meeting under the Open Meeting Act? The basics, which in the next few slides we'll go a little bit more into detail. One is giving notice to the public by posting an agenda of the topics to be discussed at the meeting at least 10 days in advance of the meeting. 2, giving opportunities for public comment. 3, the meetings have to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act and non-discrimination rules. And 4, a physical meeting location. And we'll talk more about that, where obviously you all are not in the same physical meeting location, but there's been some changes over the last few years with the pandemic, and recently with that kind of settling down to some extent, and the statutory changes that were passed in the Open Meeting Act as a result. So the notice requirement, you'll see on screen here, notice has to be given at least 10 days in advance of the meeting, and it requires, quote, a specific agenda for the meeting containing a brief description of the items of business to be transacted or discussed in either open or closed session. So you may have, I'm sure you saw that we posted an agenda at least 10 days in advance listing the topics that we're going to be discussing today. You are generally not allowed to discuss anything that was not listed on that agenda. So earlier when we opened up for public comment for items not on the agenda, Lori mentioned that you all can listen to public comment for items not on the agenda. You can only discuss something that's raised to the extent that is necessary to decide whether you want to add it to a future agenda. And you committee members can also identify something if you want to have it added to a future agenda, but we can't go in depth and substantively discuss that if it's not on today's agenda. So hopefully that makes sense. There are provisions for like emergency situations where you can discuss something that's not on the agenda, but that's a high standard to meet and pretty unlikely. And usually if it is an emergency, you'd run it through staff and myself, and but pretty unlikely. So for the most part, everything that we want to discuss has got to be on the agenda that was posted 10 days in advance. If something were to come up and you had an idea to add something to an agenda less than 10 days, our hands would most likely be tied and we couldn't at it because the theory behind this, of course, is to give members of the public advance notice of what we're going to be talking about so that they can decide for themselves whether they want to make the time to come to the meeting or join on WebEx and give their input. Moving on, so the next kind of general topic that's one of the requirements of a public meeting is giving opportunities for public comment. I'll just read the second one that's underlined. The state body shall provide an opportunity for members of the public to directly address the state body on each agenda item before or during the state body's discussion or consideration of the item. So this is important to know, especially for our soon to be elected chairperson and vice chair. It kind of informs the flow of the meeting and of each agenda item. Again, reiterating from this statute that each agenda item requires an opportunity for public comment. Now, we didn't give an opportunity for public comment on our, moderator's directions for public comment. But apart from something like that, that's truly purely logistical, we do pause on each agenda item that's substantive and give an opportunity for public comment, even if it is an item that is information only or an item where the committee is not taking action. Each agenda item, we do open it up for public comment. And it's important where that public comment is. The statute says on each agenda item before or during the state body's discussion or consideration of the item. The usual flow of an agenda item is that it's opened up for committee discussion, and if there's going to be an action taken, a committee member might make a motion and another committee member will second that, and then any other committee discussion will take place. But before the committee actually votes on it, it's opened up to public comment. And then once all public comment has been received, if there is any further committee discussion, that'll take place. But either way, then the vote can take place. But the most important thing is the vote doesn't take place until there's been an opportunity for public comment. So you can't vote and then do public comment and then move on to the next agenda item, because the vote, you won't have had the benefit of hearing what the public had to say about it at the time that you made the vote. So, and then that's the general flow of it. That's not prescribed in statute. All that the statute says is you have to give public comment before or during discussion of the item. There may be times where, depending on what it is, it's useful to start out with public comment before hearing from the committee, or maybe even take a couple of public comment sessions, during the discussion and then right before the vote. It kind of depends, but the usual flow of it is what I said for most of the agenda items. And if you watch the board meetings, that's typically how that's done. But the legal requirement is that it be before or during the discussion or consideration of the item. This I'm just going to touch on real briefly. In the next slide, we'll be talking about the physical meeting location and the rules regarding Americans with Disabilities Act and non-discrimination kind of tie in the most with respect to the physical meeting locations. So, in situations where we do have to have a physical meeting location, that location needs to comply with these provisions. That's something that you as committee members most likely are not going to have to really worry about all that much. Board staff generally ensure that we are compliant there. Now, physical meeting location we'll be talking about a little bit more because it's, as I said, it's a little tricky and there have been some changes. And if you were observing our meetings over the last few years, things were being done a little bit differently under some temporary authority that existed during the COVID-19 pandemic. So the Open Meeting Act is very specific about the rules regarding in-person and teleconference meetings. When the pandemic initially started, for pretty obvious reasons, meeting in person was problematic. So initially, by way of a governor's executive order and then later by statute, there was temporary authority that allowed us to have meetings entirely remotely using WebEx or Zoom or some similar online platform without having any physical meeting location. That authority no longer exists. Effective January 1 of this year, there were some new statutes passed that kind of took the place of that temporary authority and updated the in-person and the teleconference rules. And don't worry if you're not sure what I'm talking about. We're going to be talking a little bit more about what those rules are and what actually pertains to this committee. And again, this is another area where I want you to be aware of the rules, if nothing else, for your understanding of kind of why things are the way they are. But again, board staff will generally coordinate these and ensure that we are compliant with the Open Meeting Act. But just know that if you're being told that something has to be a certain way, it's most likely coming from this legal requirement and not staff insisting that you jump through extra hoops. So prior to the pandemic, there was kind of the traditional way of doing meetings, and that came from Government Code Section 11123, which allows two ways of doing meetings. One is meetings entirely in person, and that can still be done where everybody, all of the committee members and all the members of the public are all in one room that's open to the public, and there is no online format. So that's one way of doing things. That section also outlines one set of rules that allow for teleconferences. Under that set of teleconference rules, it's pretty challenging because each of the locations where you committee members would be calling in from remotely would have to be open to the public. So that would mean that location would have to be ADA compliant. A lot goes into it. But that's how things were done before the pandemic. And that still exists, that authority. But it's not the most flexible. So not going to go too much into detail there, but this slide does talk a little more in detail about that one. And the underlined portion says, each teleconference location shall be identified in the notice and agenda of the meeting or proceeding, and each teleconference location shall be accessible to the public. So again, not the most flexible method. Next slide refers to another method of doing teleconference, what's referred to in the slide as teleconference method 2, which, by the way, teleconference method 1, 2, and 3, that term is not commonly adopted. That's just for convenience in these slides. So nobody else would really understand what you're talking about if you're referring to it in that way. But Teleconference method 2 comes from the code section that's cited there, section 11123.2. That's a new section that was added effective January 1 of this year. Under this, and let me back up and say teleconference method 3, stay tuned for that, because that's the one that this committee is most likely going to be utilizing for its meetings. That's the one that we're utilizing today, in fact. But the teleconference method 1 and 2 is kind of for your awareness. Under teleconference method 2, there is a physical location where a majority of the members of the state body would have to be in person. So for a committee like this of 5 members, 3 of you would have to be in the same physical location, and then no more than 2 of you could call in remotely from a remote location that does not have to be held open to the public. But the fact that at least 3 of you would have to be in the same physical location, again, not the most flexible method, but it is a little bit more flexible than method 1 that we just talked about, because the remote locations that no more than 2 of you could call in from would not have to be held open to the public. And by the way, going back to method 1, when we were talking about holding those locations open to the public, calling in from your home, for example, would be a little tricky, because it would have to be, your home would then have to be ADA compliant, and you'd have to post a notice outside your home, and you'd have to have your home address listed on the agenda that's posted publicly, and members of the public could come to your home. Likewise, if you were to use a location other than your home, those same things apply. So that's not always something that our board and committee members are comfortable with. So this method 2, it's a little more flexible, because those remote locations don't have to be held open to the public. Moving on to teleconference method 3. This is the one I'll talk about most, because this is what you guys are going to be meeting under. And this method only applies to advisory bodies. So the actual Board of Registered Nursing itself is not an advisory body, so it can't utilize this method for doing its teleconferences. It's going to be meeting under method 1 or 2 that we talked about previously. But under this method 3, you all can call in remotely. You don't have to open your remote locations to the public. We do have to have a physical location where members of the public can attend, but we have to have only at least 1 staff member at that location. So the main difference between method 2 and method 3 is that under method 2, a majority of the committee members had to be at that physical location in person. Under this method 3, that doesn't apply, and all of you can dial in remotely. But we do have to have that location where at least 1 staff member is available, and where members of the public can attend. During the pandemic, just taking a step back, when we started utilizing WebEx and these remote technologies, our attendance at our meetings shot way up. Public participation went way up. The ease of members of the public to attend our meetings went way, way up. It didn't require folks to travel all over the state just to attend one of our meetings and either observe or participate and give their opinion. And that's a good thing, to make it easier for the public to attend and be a part of the process. So this WebEx, the tools that allow us to conduct meetings remotely, it's a great benefit. But meanwhile, the legislature was balancing competing concerns, and there are some who still really value the ability to attend in person and have that face to face, or have the ability to attend in person and not have to rely on a computer or technology. So the legislature struck some compromises and did some balancing in the statutes that it passed that were effective at the beginning of this year. And it decided that for advisory bodies, maybe it's okay to allow them to do it entirely remotely, but with a physical location. But for non-advisory bodies, they wanted a little more stringent requirement that required some face-to-face interaction. So hopefully that helps to kind of understand a little bit of the technicalities of why we do things the way we do in regards to the meeting locations and all that. So this, I mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, under the teleconference method that we're meeting under today, and under method 2 that we talked about, there's a statutory requirement that you be visible on camera during the open session. And I'll read the exception to that because it is pertinent for us today. The visual appearance of a member of the state body on camera may cease only when the appearance would be technologically impracticable, including but not limited to when the member experiences a lack of reliable broadband or internet connectivity that would be remedied by joining without video, or when the visual display of meeting materials, information, or speakers on the internet or other platform requires the visual appearance of a member of a state body on camera to cease. So again, if you have like limited internet, broadband, bandwidth, and having your camera on causes your audio to kind of glitch in and out, it may be permissible to turn your camera off if that would allow us to hear you and allow you to hear us without that glitching. Apart from that, the requirement is that you do be on camera if possible. And again, that's, I would imagine, part of the compromise that the legislature considered. Well, they're letting us off the hook as far as meeting in person for these advisory bodies, but in lieu of that, they want you on camera if possible. Lastly, on the physical location, just a few miscellaneous provisions that didn't really fit elsewhere. First of all, votes taken should be by roll call. That's where the a motion is made, and when it comes time to vote, usually the committee chairperson will go down the list of committee members and name each of you, and you'd each respond with a yes or no vote, rather than it being just all in favor say aye, and it being kind of hard to understand who said aye and who said nay. We go, by roll call, and each of you will respond when your name is called to vote yes or no. That allows the public to know, how you voted. It allows also our note takers to be able to identify that. You should know that somebody is taking notes, and there will be a set of meeting minutes drafted that basically lays out in brief what was discussed and what motions were made and the outcome. So for the person who's taking the minutes, that's also pretty helpful to do it that way. And not only that, it's legally required. Second bullet point there, during our teleconference meetings, if there's a failure of the remote means of access, in other words, if our WebEx stream goes down for some reason or is glitching, the meeting should recess until that can be reestablished, or else the meeting should be adjourned. That is to say, if we've got members of the public or committee members who are joining by some remote means, we want to make sure everybody is on board as we're progressing through the meeting and not leaving somebody behind because, WebEx was glitching in and out. We had that early on when we started using WebEx, but for the most part, it's been pretty reliable. So, but just in case, just something to keep in mind. And then last bullet point on this slide, as we've discussed, members of the public are welcome to attend these meetings, but you should know that they don't have to identify themselves. And when they're making public comment, they don't have to identify themselves. They can make a comment anonymously. It is helpful often if generally they will identify themselves, and if they're with an organization, they'll say so voluntarily. But if they choose not to, you can't insist that they do. So if you're going to ask them, sorry, who are you? Who do you represent? You have to make sure that you say you're not obligated to identify yourself. We don't want to create any implication that they have to identify themselves simply to participate in our meetings. Likewise, when there's a physical location, often there's a sign-in sheet by the door that individuals can sign just to identify that they were there. That's not required that they do so. Closed sessions, I'm not going to dwell on this much because, as I said, you won't be doing much in closed session as far as I can predict. But generally, a closed session would only occur within an open session. So you would start out with an open session and then at some point go into closed session. In order to have an open session, you would have the 10-day notice posted in advance and all the rest of it that has to comply with all the requirements, even though you might be discussing something in closed session. I gave a few examples of some of the reasons why a state body might go into closed session, but you can only do so if it's authorized by statute. So our board will often go into closed session during its meetings because the board, most often it's because the board is discussing discipline cases in closed session. But that's not really applicable here. So moving on. Taking action during meetings. I touched on this earlier. So I mentioned the flow of a particular agenda item will usually be committee discussion, a motion, a second, public comment, and then a vote. A vote to take action. In order to take action, you have to have, first of all, a quorum of committee members present. And then action is taken based on a majority vote. So distinguishing those two concepts, a quorum is a majority of the committee, and that's defined in your charter. So 3 members of this committee have to be present at a meeting for the meeting to really even take place. So if you've got only 2 members of the committee that show up to a meeting, the meeting is really not likely to even go forwards. But if you've got 3, 4, or 5 members present at a meeting, the action taken will be on a majority vote. So let's just say you've got 5 members present. Action requires 3 members voting in favor. If you've got 4 members present at the meeting, again, 3 members will constitute a majority. If you've got 3 members present at the meeting, you can take action with 2 members voting in the majority in favor of that. And then the last point here, that the committee chairperson usually is in charge of ensuring that the discussion takes place in an orderly fashion. And, you can kind of determine the level of formality to it that you want. But for the most part, the committee chair should ensure that, people are not talking over each other, and going through that flow of calling for discussion from committee members and, calling for a motion, or committee members individually can volunteer a motion, but if nobody is forthcoming with one, then the committee chair might say, does anyone have a motion? And then the committee chair will kind of proceed through directing the moderator to go to public comment. And then once that's concluded, asking for any other committee comments or doing the roll call vote. So the committee chairperson is kind of the, they're not higher than anyone else in any hierarchy or anything like that, but they do kind of fill that role of ensuring that things progress orderly. On the Open Meeting Act portion of my discussion, the next topic is the California Public Records Act, which is going to be a bit more brief, and then I'll open it up for questions. So the statutory text is there at the statutes that are on screen. And again, when you get the slides, you can click on the hyperlink to go through and peruse that at your leisure. Starting again with the kind of high-level premise of the rationale, the underlined portion says, quote, access to information concerning the conduct of the people's business is a fundamental and necessary right of every person in this state. So the Public Records Act, by the way, is shortened to PRA. And in a nutshell, it requires that agencies make public records available to any person that requests them. And the statute says, quote, each state or local agency, upon a request for a copy of records that reasonably describes an identifiable record or records, shall make the records promptly available to any person. And by the way, at the end, I'm going to have a slide on what you should do if you receive a request for records, and that's really going to be what I want you to take away. But before that point, I'm just going to be going through some of the statutes and the general kind of requirements of it. So what does it require? When our agency receives a request for records, we are required to issue a written response to that request within 10 days. Under unusual circumstances, we can extend that time frame up to an additional 14 days, but typically within 10 days, we have to issue a written response. Usually for most requests, we're able to provide the records themselves within the 10 days if it's a pretty simple, straightforward request. Sometimes it'll take longer to gather the records, but regardless, we do have to issue a response within the prescribed time frame, stating whether we will have records and when the requester can expect to receive them, etc. Next slide just says that agencies have a duty to assist members of the public to make a focused and effective request. All that is to say that if somebody makes a request to the board and we're not quite sure exactly what it is that they're after, we can't simply disregard the request or deny it. We do have an affirmative duty to try to work with the requester to help them clarify their request in a way that we can understand, or to help them phrase it in a way that identifies, an identifiable record, using the language from the previous slide. And also, just note that last bullet point says a request does not need to cite statutory authority. It doesn't need to mention the Public Records Act or applicable law in order to be considered a request under this set of statutes. If somebody makes a request for records, the agency has to know that it's under the obligation to respond to it appropriately as called for under the statutes. Another thing to know about it is we as state agency cannot condition whether we respond and how we respond and what records we disclose based on who the requester is or what they're asking for. Or I'm sorry, not what they're asking for. We can't condition it based on who they are or what their purpose is. As far as what they're asking for, there are some exemptions that we can withhold records that are subject to exemptions. But this slide is focused on saying that it doesn't matter who the requester is or what they intend to do with the records. All that matters is whether the records themselves are public or not. So, for example, we might get a request from someone in the media that we know they want to write something bad about the board. That doesn't play into our determination of how to respond to that request. Or maybe we know that the request came from an attorney who is suing the board. Again, that doesn't matter. All that matters is whether they've requested public records. The term public record under the statute is defined broadly. I'm not going to read this, but it includes physical records, it includes electronic records, it includes really anything that is recorded in any tangible or digital format. So these two code sections here were intended to probably be as broad as they could be and capture as much as they could. By the way, so the reason I'm going through all of this with you is that you all as committee members are subject to this. Of course, your personal emails and things like that are not subject to this, but to the extent that you have any writings or records that relate to committee business, those are all public records. So, we talked about before that you shouldn't be discussing things with your other committee members outside of public meetings. So as long as you abide by that, you probably won't have emails, between you and your other committee members, but you probably will have emails to and from board staff and other records and things in your possession that do relate to your position as a committee member. And those things are considered public records of a state agency. So this Public Records Act does apply to you. It's pretty rare. It's extremely rare, I can say, that we get a request that that I would have to bring you into it and start having you gather records and things. It hardly ever comes up, but it's something you definitely need to be aware of at least. And also, if nothing else, it helps to know that, for example, your email to staff could theoretically be exposed to the public. So be mindful with your tone and language and things like that. Don't be shy, and you can say what you need to say, but just be mindful that it theoretically could get exposed to the public. Exemptions to disclosure. Generally, everything is considered public record unless statute provides an exemption that says it's not. So the language that's quoted there is from a case that I find the language to be kind of helpful and illustrative of that point, and it's kind of colorful. So what the court said in this Black Panther Party case was, quote, "The objectives of the Public Records Act thus include preservation of islands of privacy upon the broad seas of enforced disclosure. So that language, again, kind of colorful language the court used to describe the default position that everything is public record, unless it is a quote island of exemption. So there are a few categories of typical exemptions that the board might claim in response to request. But unless something falls into one of those exemptions or one of the other ones listed in statute, it's public. Okay. Lastly, this is the heart of it. This is your takeaway. We don't want you committee members just out there on your own, just responding to requests without guidance and all that. The board has staff that are trained in responding to requests and ensuring that they're addressed timely and ensuring that exempt or confidential records are not disclosed, etc. I myself am often involved when staff raise up a request that might require some legal guidance. So what to do if you receive a request? Again, it's probably unlikely, but theoretically, it could come up that somebody contacts one of you, seeking you out in your capacity as a committee member on this committee and says, hey, can I get some records? So what to do in that situation? First of all, contact your staff liaison as quickly as you can, being mindful that we are under a time limit to respond to the request, and it can take time for the staff liaison to forward the request to our PRA coordinator, and they might need to get some guidance from me, etc. So there's some steps that need to take place in responding to these, and in order to ensure that we have the time we need, it helps if you forward the request as quickly as possible. Secondly, don't disclose records unless you're directed to do so for the reasons we talked about. Some of this stuff might be exempt, and we want to ensure that that analysis is done. Third, board staff will determine whether it calls for public records or whether there are exemptions that apply, bringing me in as necessary. And lastly, typically board staff will handle the response to the requester, including the written response and providing the documents. Or they might tell you, okay, this is fine, go ahead and give them the item that they asked for. But board staff will kind of call the shots on that. So hopefully that takes a little bit of the weight off of your shoulders in knowing that you're not going to be tasked with, based on this quick primer that you got with knowing how to handle these requests. You've got resources and you should use them if a request comes. Again, pretty unlikely that you'll be in that situation, but just know what we've talked about today if that should arise. Okay, so that was quite a bit. I appreciate you bearing with me, and I know it may be dry and a lot of information. So with that, I'll turn it over. If you have any questions or concerns or comments or anything, you can bring them up now. And as I said, down the line, if anything happens to come to mind that didn't on the spot here, feel free to reach out and ask.
Thank you, Reza. And as you guys are preparing comments and questions and stuff, feel free to reach out. I know we don't have a raise hand feature on this, so just unmute and speak. We're still working on trying to get all that ironed out. If we turn on the raise hand feature for the panelists, it also goes out to the attendees. And since the attendees are specifically only allowed to comment during a public comment session, that becomes a difficult thing to management here. So please just go ahead and unmute and speak. One of the things that always stood out for me on the Public Records Act is really don't do anything that you don't want to have public, and understand that at any point they do not have to take into consideration the entirety of the conversation. They can take out one sentence and say this is problematic, and it goes out on a media request or a media outlet. So always something to keep in mind as you're conducting yourself professionally as part of the state now. So good information. And really, truly, just always, as much as you can, err on the side of conducting any kind of business related to this advisory committee, utilizing a set email. Some of them, because I know that you guys, because you guys are advisory committees, do not have a DCA email address. What some members have done previously is set up a specific email that says, Karen Karp, crnaac at gmail.com. That way that is the only email that you ever use for crnaac information. And that way, if there is a Public Records Act that comes in that says, I want to see, and Karen, I'm totally picking on you right now, not for any reason other than just to use you as an example, is if anything comes in and it says, I want to see all communication between Karen Karp and the executive officer, then we can get that information from that email. You can just flip it over to Reza and I. He goes through and redacts whatever is legal to be redacted and then puts that forward in response. But that way you're not having to go through your private email or your other work email, as well as trying to, where did I speak about this in any manners, because we do have an obligation to turn that over on request. So just as a side note for y'all to kind of keep that in mind as you're setting your life up to manage this new requirement. So with that, it's also been a long day. I know we have about another hour and 45 minutes to the meeting. We could consider taking about a 5 to 10 minute stretch break, go to the bathroom, get a drink, all that kind of stuff, if there's no comments after we do public comment. Anything that come up for the members of the committee here that needs further clarification? Okay, I'm not seeing or hearing anything. Reza, that just means you did an amazing job and you covered all aspects. So at that point, board moderator, we will open it up for public comment on both Begley-Keene and Public Records Act.
We will be opening for public comment now. Please refer to the screen share for members of the public to see how they should type in their request for comment. I've activated the question and answer feature. Members of the public can indicate that they would like to make a comment by typing into the question box, I would like to make a comment. Please remember, you will have 2 minutes to make your comments. I will not give a reminder as your time approaches. I do not want to interrupt you nor cause you to lose your train of thought. I will mute your microphone and inform you that your time has expired, and we'll move on to the next member of the public. I'll pause for a moment for members of the public to type in, I would like to make a comment.
I just want to jump in. So this is an example of, even if we don't necessarily anticipate public comment, even if the item was one that it's hardly likely that anyone from the public would want to comment on, we still do have to kind of go through the motions for the reasons that hopefully you picked up on during my presentation.
Macaulay, is there any public comment in Sacramento?
Public comment here in Sacramento.
Wonderful, thank you.
Audio, Melby, there are no public requests on the Q&A. Would you like me to close this window?
Please go ahead and close it. And while you're closing that, the next action you can do, board moderators, elevate Stephen Bong, Reg Counsel, because he will be with Marissa on the next agenda item. General consensus, continue with the next agenda item, or would you guys like to take a quick 10-minute break and restart at 11?
A break, please.
Sounds good. Okay, we will come back at 11 o'clock and resume with agenda item 4.3. Thank you guys very much. Back from from a break, if you guys can turn your cameras on so that we know that you're in attendance, and then we will do a quick roll call just to make sure that everybody is back and we establish quorum again before moving forward. It is 11 o'clock. Sandra, are you in attendance?
Yes, Sandra Bordy here.
Karen? Thank you. And I know that you guys are on video, but we do record these meetings, so if you can come off mute and announce, that'd be great. Joe? Okay, we'll skip Joe and come back. Sam?
I'm here.
Thank you. Kathleen? Okay, we do have quorum. Let me see if we can.
Hi, I'm here.
Oh, you are. Perfect. Awesome. Thank you. Second. I am being told I need to go and adjust my mic.
It is a little low. I don't know if you can. That's why I kind of listen in with my old man ears.
Let me see if I can fix that. Is that
I'm sorry to interrupt. This is Sandra Bordy. I had a question about Bagley Keene, if I'm allowed to ask that at this time. I know we've moved on with the agenda. So if I'm not able to ask that, it's fine.
Nope, go ahead.
Okay, so if I recall from being on the APRN advisory committee, there was a situation in which a motion was granted to move information to the BRN. And during the BRN meeting, certain APRN advisory committee members were present at the BRN meeting and are authorized to be public members, but are unable to speak on that particular agenda item. Is that correct?
So that's a good question. So I don't think we need to constrain ourselves like that anymore. I think that's been a concern with the Department of Consumer Affairs, some of the boards and that have advisory committees. I don't know how much in detail you want me to go, but I do think we have a exception in Bagley Keene that allows members of a advisory committee to speak at a noticed meeting of the state body that they advise. I sometimes will have like a standing agenda item that's actually identified as update from CRN, AAC, or NPAC, where a representative of the committee is actually slated to come and update the board. Alternatively, or beyond that, if you wanted to make public comment, I do feel like there's authority there in the Open Meeting Act.
I think, Reza, one of the other things that we can do, and I'm not sure if you guys are able to hear me, is it's working well?
Yes.
Okay. Is when we put the agenda item on the meeting, for the board meeting, we can put down people that will be presenting it. And that way the public knows exactly who is going to be presenting at the meeting and what to expect. So if we had a CRNAAC agenda item on there, and we can put in the agenda item summary that'll be presented by Sandra Bordy. And then that way we know specifically, and the public knows specifically exactly who to expect, and have that done. You can do, it could be a group presentation by the chair and vice chair, because that's two people. What we don't want is more than two people showing up at the board meeting and presenting, because then we would have to notice the board meeting as well as a CRNAAC.
So that's where I think we're okay, Lori. Yeah, I think, and for those who are interested, section 11122.5 government code, which talks about exceptions of things that are not going to be considered a meeting. So if members of this committee are showing up at a noticed board meeting and talking about items that are listed specifically on the agenda of that board meeting, that should be fine. To draw a kind of fine, a fine line distinction, if you were to speak about something that's not listed on the agenda of the board meeting that's within the jurisdiction of this committee, then it's potentially problematic. But if you're responding to something that is on the board meeting agenda as, a member of the public or on your own behalf, that's fine. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up.
Switching again because the board moderator said it was still bad. Is this better? Okay, good. Got the nod.
Sounds pretty good.
I'm not sure what is going on. I blame it on state equipment, board moderator. I'm joking. Okay, we will go on to agenda item 4.3, that is legislation, regulation, and rulemaking. And we do have Marissa Clark. She's the Chief of Legislation for BRN, as well as Stephen Vong, who is a regulatory counsel for Department of Consumer Affairs, who will take over and manage this portion of the meeting. Thank you.
Great, everyone. Excited to be here. As Lori said, my name is Marissa, and I'm the Chief of Legislative Affairs. And so before we kind of dive into the wonderful world of regulations, I want to start at the beginning and provide a brief overview of how a bill moves through the legislative process and ultimately becomes statute before regulations can be developed. So the legislative process, it can take a million different twists and turns. And so this is by no means an exhaustive presentation, but just touches on some of the key steps that most bills will go through on their way to becoming law. Next slide, please. So every bill starts out as an idea from somewhere, and those ideas really can come from anyone. Members of the public, very common, legislative advocates, private companies, nonprofit organizations, community-based organizations, state agencies, legislative staff, and the members themselves. So while anyone can have the idea, only an assembly member or senator can turn those ideas into actual bills. And so then we go to bill introduction. And the bill introduction process occurs every year in January and February. And the deadline for members to introduce bills usually falls somewhere in the middle of February. It's typically right before the President's Day weekend. So this year, the deadline to introduce bills is Friday, February 16th. And bills that are introduced in the Assembly are assigned the prefix AB for Assembly Bill. Bills introduced in the Senate are assigned the prefix SB for Senate Bill. And each introduced bill is assigned a number in order over a 2-year period. And then at the end of the 2-year session, the numbering process starts all over again. So right now we are actually in the second year of a 2-year session. So the bills numbering as they start to get introduced are going to pick up from where the first year ended. But then if we move forward a year and a new session starts, it'll start all over again with AB1, SB1, so on and so forth. So after a bill has been introduced and handed over to the clerk at the member's house, the bill is then read for the first time. And a reading of a bill in either the Assembly or the Senate is essentially just a presentation of the bill before the House. And that is where they read the bill's number, the bill's author, and the bill's title. And according to the California Constitution, a bill has to be read 3 times before it can be debated and voted on by either house. Committee. So then we go to the Policy Committee. And first, the Rules Committee. Each House will have a Rules Committee that meets and refers each bill to a Policy Committee based on the subject matter of the bill. And the Policy Committee in the House of Origin is where the bill will be discussed by members of the legislature and just the general public for the very first time. However, a bill can't be heard immediately after it's introduced. The rules of the legislature state that a bill can't be discussed by a policy committee until 30 days after it's been introduced. So for example, a bill that's introduced today couldn't be heard in a policy committee until middle of February, around the 18th or so. So during a policy committee hearing, the author will present the bill to the committee, and then they will receive testimony and public comment heard in support of or in opposition to the bill. And there are a variety of different policy committees in each house with members and staff that kind of specialize in different topic areas. So kind of broader subjects such as education, health, labor, transportation, kind of those umbrella areas. Most of the bills that would impact the Board of Registered Nursing go through the Assembly and the Senate Business and Professions Committee. These are also the committees that oversee the sunrise and the sunset processes of the various boards and bureaus under the Department of Consumer Affairs. And so the policy committee would then vote to either pass the bill, so just in its current form, pass the bill as amended, so with some changes to the language, or hold the bill in committee, which essentially means the bill is dead for the time being. Right, next slide, please. Thank you. And so if a bill has an associated cost with it, then it will be referred to a fiscal committee, which is known as the Appropriations Committee. And both Appropriations Committee in either House, the Senate and the Assembly, have something called a suspense file. And suspense file was created as a way to kind of consider the fiscal impacts of legislation more on a whole basis rather than voting on the bills in kind of a piecemeal fashion, as is done in each individual hearing with policy committees. So if a bill is anticipated to cost more than a specified threshold, it's placed on suspense, where it sits until there's a vote-only suspense hearing that is held right prior to the deadline for fiscal committees to hear and report bills to the floor. And each house has a little bit different of a threshold in terms of what constitutes a bill being placed on suspense. So in the Senate, if a bill is anticipated to cost $50,000 or more of general fund money, it'll be placed on suspense, or $150,000 more of special funds, it'll be placed on suspense. And special funds are a little bit different. Those are things like taxes and fees that are designated by law for a specific purpose. And the BRN is actually a specially funded entity, as we are supported through our licensing fees. We aren't supported predominantly through the general fund like a lot of other state programs are. So then in the Assembly, it's just kind of an across the board. If a bill is anticipated to cost more than $150,000 of any type of funds, it'll be placed on that suspense file. So after the suspense hearing, bills are either moved to the floor of their respective houses for further consideration, or again, they can be held in committee, which essentially means they're dead for the time being. And the Appropriations Committee in either house tends to be the most common place for bills to be held in committee. Obviously, you're talking about costs and money. Money is a finite resource, especially in years like this. So it is a little bit of a higher bar to get those bills out of the fiscal related committees. Right, and then they move to the floor of their House of Origin. So Assembly bills, Assembly floor, Senate bills, Senate floor, where they're read a second time, just going through the title, the author, and all that, and then they're assigned to the third reading. And once that bill has their third reading, that is when it is kind of presented by the author and discussed by the full membership. They're able to have an actual kind of debate around the bill, discuss the pros, the cons, kind of indicate their support, their opposition, and then a vote is taken. And most bills can pass through with a majority vote. There's a couple exceptions, such as tax measures or bills that contain urgency clauses. An urgency clause means that the bill would take effect right when the governor signs it versus January 1 of that following year. And in order for a bill that has either of those provisions in it to pass off the floor, it would need a 2/3 vote versus a majority vote. So just a little bit of a higher bar. And so if a bill does then get voted off the floor in its house of origin, it moves to the second house where the entire process literally just starts all over again. So the assembly bill moves to the Senate side, Senate bills move to the assembly side, and then they go back way through their rules committee, the policy committee, the fiscal committees, and then to the floor again. Next slide. And then the hopeful last and final step, if a bill makes it through both houses, would be that it goes to the governor's desk. And once a bill comes to the governor's desk, they have three kind of main choices in terms of actions or lack of action they can take. The governor can sign the bill, making it law and making it statute. The governor can veto the bill and just reject it altogether, usually with some type of veto message. Or the governor can choose to take no action. And this isn't very common, but it is an option. And if the governor takes no action within the required timeline, it allows for something called a pocket signature. And it's referred to a pocket signature because it means the bill will automatically become law without a signature. And so you may have heard actually the opposite of this happens at the federal level, where if the president does not act on a bill in the required timeline, the bill is, rather than automatically signed, it's automatically vetoed. So it's referred to as a pocket veto. So at the state level, the governor has around 12 days to sign a bill after it's been presented to them. However, the governor will have up to 30 days to sign a bill if it's in the first year of the 2-year session and they receive the bill with less than 12 days until the legislature adjourns for recess, or it's in the second year of the 2-year session, which is where we are now, and the governor receives the bill on or after August 20th. And the majority of the bills make it to the governor's desk, have that 30-day timeline, because while there are some bills that definitely kind of move really, really quickly, not a lot of concerns, amendments, opposition, they kind of go smoothly. They'll hit the desk maybe in middle of session, then they'll have that 12-day turnaround. A good chunk of them kind of are moving through the process all throughout the session. And so hitting the desk at the very same time. So that's why you have that longer 30-day timeline for the governor to kind of get through that really large number of bills. So once signed by the governor, most bills will go into effect that January 1 of the following year, except for, as I mentioned, if they had that urgency clause in them, then they will take effect immediately upon the governor's signature. Next slide. Right, so you may wonder where the board fits into all of this process. So throughout the entire legislative session, board staff, aka myself, is identifying and tracking and analyzing any bills that could have an impact on the board's operations or just the general field of nursing as a whole. So then at each full board meeting, there's usually a standing item for legislative updates. For that agenda item, we'll typically provide members with a written analysis of the bill and then kind of provide a verbal overview of any either newly introduced or recently amended bills that we think may be of interest. And at that point, board members then can have just an open discussion about each individual bill, debate the pros and cons, ask clarifying questions, and also receive input from members of the public through public comments. So after kind of a robust discussion, members can decide whether or not they would like to take a formal position on a bill. They don't have to. They could also continue to just kind of monitor the bill and decide, we'll take kind of a watch position. We'll just see what happened as it moves through the process. Or if they do decide to take a formal position on a bill, there's a long list of different positions that can be taken, but there's around 4 that are probably the most common that you'll see. And that would be support, we like the bill as is, support with amendments, we like the bill, but we think there could be some things done to improve it, oppose unless amended, meaning that without these changes, we would oppose the bill, or just a flat out oppose. Those are pretty common, although not the only positions that can be taken. So if a formal position is taken, board staff are then responsible for communicating that position and any other pertinent information, such as the reason for the position, maybe some suggested alternate language, to the author's office, as well as to the relevant legislative committees where the bill is going to be heard and debated. And then bills that, as I mentioned, are ultimately passed by the legislature, signed by the governor, assigned a chapter number by Secretary of State, and chapter numbers are then referred to as statute. So once it's been signed and chaptered, then it becomes statute, and it's included as part of the California codes. And just for your own reference, we touched on it a little bit, but the statutes that establish the Board of Registered Nursing, kind of our mission, our authority, our duties, can be found under Division 2, Chapter 6 of the Business and Professions Code. And I believe, let me double check, the CRNA specific provisions are under Article 7, title being Nurse Anesthetist. Sorry. So when implementing a recently chaptered bill, typically one of the first steps a state agency will take is to establish regulations. And so regulations are sometimes called rules, and they are drafted by state agencies like the board and other entities to basically implement, interpret, and add specificity around the statutes that were passed by the legislature and signed by the governor. So as Lori mentioned, our board reg counsel, Stephen, will walk you through kind of the rulemaking process, how those regulations are established. But before I pass it off, are there any questions around kind of the legislative process as a whole and any of the information I covered?
So just to jump in here really quick, I know this is probably kind of overwhelming and a bit confusing, but what Marissa and I have noticed, we meet with several stakeholders multiple times a week, and many get confused over what the board has kind of power over. Anything that is in our statute, which would be like our business profession codes, those we don't have any authority over. Those go through the bill introduction, they go through the legislative process. We do sometimes get involved in communication if we're invited to the table to have conversations about it. And then our board does take a vote on that, on whether they watch, whether they oppose, whether they support, etc. But if there's something in statute, we at the board level cannot change that. And so when you see something in the Business Professions Code, which was what Reza brought up, and it's also in the charter, that is unchangeable at this moment, and it would have to go through bill introduction and legislation to update and change that. That is where your scope of practice is established. And I know that there was concerns potentially that this upcoming regulation, if you guys were to start working on that, would change the scope of practice for nurse anesthetist. And no, it will not, because scope of practice is set in statute. When you look at the regulatory process, which will be covered more in depth with Stephen when he starts up, that is kind of, you can liken it to a hospital's policies and procedures. It's what is needed to carry out the law that was established by the legislator. So it is only as far-reaching as the statute gives us authority to do. So if the statute says you must do this, then we have to stay within that guideline. If the statute doesn't even speak on it, a lot of times regulations can't even be made on that unless we have some kind of ability to tie it back. So those are things to kind of keep in the back of your mind as we kind of go through this process. As we're developing regulations, as we're moving that forward, as we're making recommendations to the board, also understand that that is at minimum about a 2-year process. That is not something that goes quickly. And so we'll make sure that Stephen kind of elaborates on that and we go on to that. But I wanted to kind of ask any questions here of the members right now. If you have any questions on the difference between regs and statutes, and if you have any specific questions on statutory authority and how that comes about and how anything can be changed or moved at that level. I'm not seeing or hearing anything. Okay, Marissa, we'll move it on to, if you're done, then I think you were, we'll move it on to Stephen.
Great, thanks, and great summary, Marissa. And as Lori mentioned too, there is a hierarchy of law. I know, I'm guessing y'all didn't go to law school and went to nursing school or qualified as nurses. So Reza wanted me to do a reminder that there is a hierarchy of law. First is the California Constitution. When we're talking about state law, there's federal law and state law. And there's the California Constitution, and then there's statute, and then there's regulations. And BRN is obviously the regulator for nurses in California. So for my presentation, I'm just going to start off with the introduction of who I am and then discuss your role as board committee members in the regulatory process and provide a general, very high-level overview in less than 16 slides. Normally, OAL does its training in 3 days, and I'm trying to do it in less than half an hour. So it will be very quick. So my name is Stephen Vong. I'm an attorney with the state of California for over 6 years. I've been counsel for Jerry Brown at the Governor's Office of Legal Affairs. I've been a Deputy Attorney General at the Department of Justice, and I also have done consumer protection law at the Department of Financial Protection and Innovation. And now I'm currently DCA legal counsel, where I advise BRN along with other healing arts boards, such as acupuncture, chiropractor, and other agencies such as the Court Reporter Board, the State Athletic Commission, the Bureau of Security and Investigative Services, and the Bureau of Private Post-Secondary Education. So as you can tell from my background, I'm pretty much a generalist. I don't practice in any specific, I'm not a subject matter expert on nursing or healthcare law particularly, and I'm just more qualified in procedural aspects. So today we'll be discussing the process of adopting regulations through a regular rulemaking process. And the most common form of rulemaking is regular rulemaking under the California Administrative Procedure Act, APA. And as I said before, we'll discuss your role in the process, which is highlighted in this flow chart. And as you can see, most of it will be in the beginning of the process where board committee members are involved in coming up with the concept and drafting the language of the text. So if we move on to the next slide, we'll have 4 stages for regulatory rulemaking. The first is a concept where we define a problem and propose text, what we want to have in regulation. The second is a production phase where the regulatory text and supporting document are prepared for filing with the Office of Administrative Law. That's a state agency that approves the regulations and maintains all the regulations on the California Code of Regulations, which is accessible online. And then the next phase, the third phase, is the initial phase, where the formal adoption process begins by filing the proposed text and rulemaking documentation with OAL for publication with the public. And there's a 45-day public comment period and possibly 1 or more hearings to receive public comments. And the last phase is final, where the board responds to comments received during the comment period, decides whether to modify the text, and then acts as a board meeting to approve the final text to send to OAL. After that, board staff, as you've seen, finalizes supporting documentation and submits the rulemaking to OAL. So as I mentioned before, this is where you might be most involved, the concept phase. So concept is the pre-filing, pre-publication phase where most of the heavy lifting occurs. And the board committee members and board should address all of these objectives listed on this slide prior to filing a proposed regulation to help ensure a successful outcome. So the more work that we put in this stage, such as defining the problem, describing objectives we hope to achieve, and consulting with possible subject matter experts, and we also have to consider the financial implications. There's a lot of technical documents that come in the rulemaking process where you do economic and fiscal impact analysis, and then why the regulatory text is necessary. If we can consider all those factors when you're proposing text, then it's easier to have that text approved by the Office of Administrative Law. So the next slide, we'll talk about board committee member role in concept development, and highlighted are the parts where board committee members are involved. So in this section, first we'll talk about how an idea for a regulation might come from. So as Marissa mentioned, it might come from statute. It could come from board staff. It could come from yourselves, and as Lori mentioned, and other industry groups, lobbyists, that kind of thing, and people who interact with nurses as well as whatever ideas you have from your experience and knowledge to propose an idea of something that should be in regulation. So to start the process, the board's president, in consultation with Lori, the board's executive officer, will place a regulatory concept on the board's agenda for discussion and possible action. Typically, the board staff will develop concept for regulatory proposals and bring these items to a board meeting and present the items to the board for discussion. However, if the proposal involves complicated or technical subject matter, the board may use a variety of methods to develop language, which may include assigning development activities to a board committee such as yourselves to discuss. So as a board committee member, your role in the regulatory process may include suggestions as to concepts that should be in regulations, particularly in future meetings. Also, you should note that the APA, or Administrative Procedure Act, requires the rulemaking body to include as part of the formal rulemaking package all factual information that the agency relied on in adopting the regulations. So any kind of data or studies or meeting minutes are all included in the rulemaking package. So the next slide will be a sample of a committee of a different board under the Department of Consumer Affairs that's been tasked by the board to work on development of text at a publicly noticed committee meeting. And the way it works back is that you'll report back to the board by the way of meeting minutes from these committee meetings. The board may also choose to delegate tasks to staff to set up stakeholder meetings or contract with subject matter experts or SMEs to provide the board with ideas for areas that need to be specified in regulation. All these options should be set forth in meeting materials, typically in memos and attachments in the board's meeting materials. So once the final draft concept is ready, the next step will be board concept approval, which is on the next slide. The proposed text is generally provided in a document called proposed language to the board members after you have presented your concepts and drafted text. And the text is usually shown in underline for additions and strikeouts for deletions. So that's clear what proposed changes BRN will ultimately be approving. You can see examples of proposed text on BRN's regulations page on their website. BRN will usually list proposed language that have been considered and also regulations that have been finalized and approved by OAL also. The document is provided with a cover memo to the board members explaining the problem and describing how the staff's proposal would address the problem and suggesting possible motions that board members may act to make up on the proposal. So we can move on to the next slide for staff production. So this is more of on the board staff side. It's where we combine all of the technical documents for the rulemaking package. As I mentioned before, it involves coordinating with a lot of people, with the board staff, with the Department of Finance, with fiscal, and preparing these sometimes long and technical documents. So once we finish this stage, BRN staff submits the final file to the Office of Administrative Law and Department of Finance for publication in the Notice Register and review. At this stage, before we do that, it's also reviewed by the Department of Consumer Affairs Director and the California Business Consumer Services and Housing Agency. So that just adds on to make sure that all the policy is good, but it's just a lot of layers of review before we get approval to file with the Office of Administrative Law. So the next slide will also show that once that the board votes to approve language that U.S. committee members have presented to draft, that staff is, after all the stages, that will file the initial package with the Office of Administrative Law. And there'll be a document called the Notice of Proposed Action, which must be published in the California Regulatory Notice at least 45 days prior to any hearing and 45 days prior to the close of public comment period set forth in the notice. OAL is responsible for this publication once it has accepted a notice, and once the notice is approved, BRN will mail out the Notice of Proposed Action to interested parties. It'll be on a listserv. Most of y'all might have seen those emails before. And other representative businesses, and BRN will also post on its website at least 45 days prior to any hearing and the close of a public comment period. So the next slide shows the next phase after that. In the 45-day comment period, board members must consider all comments on a regulation, be they in favor or against, whether they're anonymous or they're from a large association or lobbying group, and staff will prepare proposed responses to comments and request the board's decision to accept comments or to modify the regulatory text once the comment period closes at a notice board meeting. If the board votes to accept comments and modify text, a notice of modified text will be issued, and that period is either 15 days or 45 days. And this process will continue until the board decides to make no further modifications to the text. One thing also is that we only have 1 year after we publish an initial notice for OAL to decide on. Otherwise, we have to restart the whole process of the notice publication again. So once the board decides to make no further modifications, then the board will direct staff into motion and be the final approver of the regulatory text. And then after that, it again goes through the executive director to make sure that there's no substantive changes to it. And usually a motion will say that if there's no adverse comments and no modifications, then we can proceed to complete the rulemaking and send it to the Office of Administrative Law. And that will complete the next phase. And we can move on to the next slide, which is continuing the initial phase. So as you can tell, proposed text can change a lot. The board may see proposed text come back a number of times when substantive language changes, as staff receives input from legal counsel, or as laws change, or public policy interpretation changes during the process. So I know Lori had previously mentioned that this process is a minimum of 2 years. There have been times where DCA's boards have had regulations take 4 to 5 years to finalize because of all the back and forth and public comments and edits and legislative changes occurred while the rules were being developed. So if we are able to get to the final phase, which will be on the next slide, once the board decides on final proposed language at a notice board meeting, and the board would delegate authority to the executive officer, Lori, to finalize the package and complete the rulemaking process. So if the motion is to approve the text, then we'll delegate Lori the authority to make non-substantive changes, such as correcting typographical errors, and adopt the regulations as approved by the board and notice and complete the rulemaking process. So if any control agency, such as Department of Finance or Office of Administrative Law, refuses to approve the proposal and package may be withdrawn and brought back to the board for further deliberation and action at a board meeting. So those are generally a very high level of this possibly 5-year process in just a few slides. But going back to your specific role as board committee members, we'll discuss it on the next slide. As a board committee member, legal will suggest that you read whatever staff memos and associated documents come your way, and that you be prepared as subject matter experts in nursing to ask questions, listen to comments, and discuss at each meeting. In preparation for your board committee meetings, you should read staff prepared memos, you should read text, and all underlying data provided to you for any meetings on behalf of board staff. The memos are important as they provide options and reasons for proposal. Additionally, supplemental materials may show you why proposed text is necessary, what the new regulations might look like, or what is being changed in the original regulations. And when you're reading materials, you should list any questions you might have so you can come to the meeting prepared and can ask staff for clarity or even approach staff prior to the meeting. As a board committee member, you may ask questions such as possible alternatives, or you may look or ask staff or a committee of the board to research how other states and other programs are handling similar issues. The next slide will talk about the considerations again. So we can ask you to consider the law you're about to make and reviewing the regulations with the following questions in mind. Are there unintended consequences? Is this the least restrictive alternative or interpretation that your agency can choose to implement the law? And on the next slide also, there will be 6 main questions that the Office of Administrative Law will use to evaluate the standards of proposed regulations. So try to keep these in mind as you're drafting text that might affect all licensees that you work with. Is it necessary? Do you have the authority to adopt these regulations? For example, as Marissa and Lori and Reza have mentioned, is it going to be in statute? Do we have the statutory authority? Does the proposal make specific or interpret a law under your jurisdiction? Is it clear? That's the big question where the Office of Administrative Law will say, hey, this can be reasonably interpreted in multiple ways. This is not clear. So the clarity standard is if a reasonable licensee would understand the regulation and how it applies to them. Another question to consider is it in harmony with, or does it conflict with California or federal statutes or other regulations? And lastly, does it duplicate something already required in state or federal law or regulations? So I know that was very quick, and I tried to do my best to condense what is normally a 3-day training in less than half an hour. So if you have any questions, I know this is a lot, but feel free to unmute yourself, and yeah.
Just to kind of talk about that procedurally as well is just looking at timeframes for this. And so when you as a committee start to go through this process, we will in a future agenda, hoping we'll get there today, but not sure that we'll get to that agenda item today, where we're looking at subcommittees. If in a subcommittee you guys look at development of regulations or kind of break it amongst each other, you can do some work in between these in between these scheduled meetings, drafting language, looking at various points of input, and then that comes forward. And you guys, at any of those meetings that you guys hold as a subcommittee, Reza, myself, Macaulay, any of us can be pulled in at any point and provide some information, as well as Stephen. We've done that in the past with NPAC and NMAC. Then that information is brought forward to this committee. This committee then looks at the language. It goes out for public to have some input during public comment, etc. And that is shared and discussed. And then whatever is accepted goes forward to the board. The board may alter that regulatory language that you guys put forward as well during that process. They may accept it in whole, but they may also alter it. That process takes months, maybe even a year. You guys have 2 meetings a year. The board meets 4 times a year. And so those will go through several processes. And then we put that stuff out for comment, and that has a set period of time. And then there's comments. Every single comment received, whether it's in favor or not in favor, has to be responded, and then that has to go back in front of the board. And if the board then says, yes, everything's good, I'm not changing it, then that moves forward to the next step. But they may decide to change it based on public comment, and then that goes back out to another public commenting period. So when we say at minimum 2 years, I've seen this take 2-3 years and longer to get regulations to a stage that can be put forward to OAL for final approval. There are times where it makes it through all the checks and it goes through BRN and DCA, and it goes through agency and up to OAL, and then we have to pull it back at the stage of OAL because something is wrong there. And so then we have to pull that back and we start that process again. And so with all the various layers in there, it is important to kind of know that this is not an expedited process at all, and will take time and does have a lot of reviews and a lot of feedback.
Thanks, Lori, for that follow-up. And I just wanted to say also, DRN does have resources of previous regulations that have been approved on its website. So I think that's a great source, just the regulations page on BRN, if you have any follow-up questions. And the Office of Administrative Law will also post generally about the rulemaking process if you have specific questions as to that. But thanks again for your time. Really appreciate it.
This is Reza. I had just Lori, I think you're speaking, but you're on mute. Just a couple quick things.
Totally okay.
Thanks. 2 real quick things. Stephen did a great job. A lot of information in a concise presentation. Couple things I wanted to add to it. One is he talked about the authority to implement regulations, and the BRN, any state agency, is not at liberty to just pass any regulation that it wants. It has to have authority in generally in statute. And the way that that shows up in statute is one of a couple ways. One, I mentioned at the beginning, I cited the section from the Nursing Practice Act, section 2826, which specifically says the board shall consider the standards of blah, 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 and basically decide whether to impose more stringent standards. That's an example of one where it's almost calling out that the board can pass regulations. Other statutes will just say outright the board may pass regulations to implement this. So there are statutes that pretty clearly say the board can pass regulations to flesh this out and implement it. And then the other category where the board will have authority to pass regulations is where a statute is susceptible to multiple interpretations, and we want to adopt a particular interpretation and make that the rule that the board is going to implement. So in those situations, I don't have an example for you, but it's going to be a situation where the statute doesn't explicitly call out the need for regulations, but somebody reading that statute might think, well, you could interpret it this way or that way, and the board decides it wants to be more specific. Apart from those situations, and Stephen, I hope you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but apart from those situations, the board doesn't necessarily have authority to pass regulations. So that's where, you have to, when we submit a package to the Office of Administrative Law, we have to identify the statute that is providing the authority. In other words, the statute that we are that allows us to make the regulation, and the statute that we are either implementing or making more specific. So there are some limitations to the board's rulemaking authority. So as you are coming up with ideas, let your creativity run wild and come up with any ideas you think are good for the regulation of the profession, but just don't be shocked if you put forward an idea and find out that, well, the authority behind for the board to do that via rulemaking is kind of questionable, or it's not there. In those situations where we don't have authority, that proposal would have to go through legislation, not regulation. And as was discussed, legislation would have to go through the legislature. The other thing I wanted to just mention, just a concept for you to be familiar with, is the concept of underground regulations. So the term regulation is defined in the Administrative Procedures Act. It's pretty broad. It means, quote, every rule, regulation, order, or standard of general application, not exactly going to implement, interpret, or make specific the law enforced or administered by it, or an amendment of any rule, regulation, order, or standard of general application. So a standard of general application, if you kind of think about what that means, that's anything that the board wants to say, okay, this is the rule, this is how we're going to apply it in every situation. If the board wants to set forth a rule that it's going to apply in a standardized way in every situation, that would meet the definition of a regulation. And if it meets the definition of a regulation, we have to go through this Administrative Procedures Act, or APA, rulemaking process that could take years. So what an underground regulation is something we need to avoid. And that's an underground reg is something that would meet the definition of a regulation, but for which we did not follow the APA process. So if the board takes a statute and just says, okay, this is how we're going to interpret it from now on in all cases, that arguably would be a regulation. And if the board just did that by announcing it without going through this formal process that Stephen walked us through, that would be an underground regulation, and that's a problem. We can't do things in that way. So, the process that they talked about, you might be noticing a theme with some of these legal processes that they do slow things down quite a bit, and they make it kind of cumbersome and it's not necessarily the most efficient and direct route, but there are kind of higher policy reasons for slowing things down in that way. There are times when, maybe members of the public or just folks who are not real familiar with this rulemaking process think that the board really ought to be taking urgent action on something, maybe a new development, maybe, during COVID or something. Unless it's a true bona fide emergency that really meets a very high threshold, the board has to go through that formal, lengthy process, and we can't just snap our fingers and make something happen. So just wanted to put those concepts as well in your mind. Thank you.
Thank you. So one more last check to see if there's any comments or questions from the committee, and we'll open it up to public comment as this is information only. Okay, board moderator, please open up to public comment.
We will be opening for public comment now. Please refer to the screen share for members of the public to see how they should type in their request for comment. I've activated the question and answer feature. Members of the public can indicate that they would like to make a comment by typing into the question box, "I would like to make a comment." Please remember, you will have 2 minutes to make your comments. I will not give a reminder as your time approaches. I do not want to interrupt you nor cause you to lose your train of thought. I will mute your microphone and inform you that your time has expired, and we'll move on to the next member of the public. I'll pause for a moment for members of the public to type in, "I would like to make a comment." Board EO Melby, there are no public requests for comments on the WebEx. Do we have any public requests for comments in the Sacramento office?
Comments here in Sacramento.
Thank you. Would you like me to close this window?
Yes, please. And we'll move on to agenda item 5.0. Okay. So agenda item 5.0 is where you guys as a committee will recommend and vote on a chair and vice chair of this committee. And typically how that goes is any of the 5 of you can either nominate yourself or somebody else to be the chair. And if that person accepts that nomination or any people, number of people accept the nomination, then we would open that up to a vote. And then we'll move on from there to the vice chair. So at this moment, is there anybody that would like to recommend themselves or recommend somebody else to be chair of this committee?
This is Karen Karp, and I would like to move to nominate Samantha Polakowski as chair of the CRNA Advisory Committee.
Thank you, Joe. Samantha.
I know that was Joe, but just a reminder.
Interested in?
Hi, thank you for the nomination. I have to say this is my first time on a committee, so I'm not sure that I'm the best person to take the role.
If you are interested in accepting it, we do work with you extensively on this. You will be meeting with Reza, myself, and Macaulay on a regular basis and can work through that so that we are here to assist you. But if you are not interested in accepting that, that is something that you would speak to right now as well. And then we can get other nominations.
I'm happy to do it. I just wanted to be clear about my experience.
No worries. Is there anybody else that is interested in being chair or want to recommend anybody other than Samantha to be chair of this committee? Okay. So it looks like we do have a motion on the table for Samantha to be chair and by Karen, and Joe seconded that. We will hold that. We'll do a vice chair and then we'll go out to public comment all at once for that before you guys take a final vote on that. So is there any recommendations for nomination of yourself or somebody else for a vice chair of this committee?
This is Karen Karp. I recommend Joe Martin as vice chair of the committee.
Okay, Joe, is that something that you would be willing to accept?
Yes, I'd accept the nomination. Thank you.
Okay, so we do have is there anybody else that would like to recommend another person or themselves for a vice chair of this committee? Okay, so it looks like Joe is put forward as vice chair. I have Karen as a first. Do we have a second?
Motion.
Wonderful. Board moderator, if we can go out to public comment, please.
We will be opening for public comment now. Please refer to the screen share for members of the public to see how they should type in their request for comment. I've activated the question and answer feature. Members of the public can indicate that they would like to make a comment by typing into the question box, "I would like to make a comment." Please remember, you will have 2 minutes to make your comments. I will not give a reminder as your time approaches. I do not want to interrupt you nor cause you to lose your train of thought. I will mute your microphone and inform you that your time has expired, and we'll move on to the next member of the public. I'll pause for a moment for members of the public to type in, "I would like to make a comment."
Quick point of procedure. If you're making a motion or responding with a second, it is helpful if you just say who you are before you're jumping in. It's usually pretty obvious, but for those who are taking our minutes, that does help a lot. Thanks.
Board EO Melby, there are no public requests for comments on the WebEx. Are there any public requests for comments in Sacramento?
Nope, we do not have any public comments here in Sacramento.
Thank you. Would you like me to close this window?
Okay, so the motion on the table is for, and Sam, I'm going to butcher your last name. Can you say it one time again really quick?
It's phonetical. It's Polakowski.
Wonderful.
Don't worry about butchering it. Used to it.
So it looks like we have Samantha Polakowski and Joe Martin as chair and vice chair, as a motion and a second for the CRNA Advisory Committee. I would like to open this up to a roll call vote. Joe? I'm not able to hear you. Yeah, there we go.
Yes.
That's okay. Thank you. Karen?
Karen Karp, yes.
Kathleen?
Kathleen Theobald, yes.
Samantha?
Yes.
And Sandra? Wonderful. So moved. We will move on to the next agenda item, please. And this is agenda item to discuss the upcoming advisory committee dates. We do have a calendar in and attached. You can see that today's is on there, and we'll have another one that is tentatively scheduled for August 9th, 2024. Does anybody have any issues with that date so that we can establish quorum potentially and plan to move this forward?
This is Sandra Bordy. I will be, out of the state at that time, so I'll be on vacation. I will not be here.
Okay. Is there a different proposed date? I mean, we would still have quorum, but we do like to try to accommodate as many people as we can. Is there another date in the early parts of August that would work for you, or are you out all of the beginning of August, Sandra, sorry.
No, Sandra Bordy here. The big thing is we also have a national convention the first weekend in August, which takes a lot of time, but then I'll be out on vacation after that. So probably the 7th, like the end of August is probably better for CRNAs.
End of August. Okay, we do have a board meeting. If we can make a motion that we would accept a advisory committee for the last half of August. We can leave it out to those final 2 weeks if that works for everybody. And then we can work to get a date set by email with you guys similarly to the way that we did today, and then have it posted for the remainder. Is the end of August an option for all of you guys?
This is Karen Karp. I would appreciate a date change as well.
Okay. To the end of August, or
to the end
are
of
we
August.
End of August. Okay.
End of August. Thank you.
Is there anybody opposed to moving this option to the last 2 weeks of August as working out a timeline for that? We do also have our board meeting that is August 21st to 22nd. So those dates would not work because I will be in that board meeting, but it would be good to work around those dates and work with you, and we can work with Macaulay on that going forward through email.
The only date that currently doesn't work for me in that time frame is August 28th. I already have a meeting scheduled for that day.
Okay. Perfect. So I will ask that a motion be made to accept the dates for an upcoming advisory committee meeting to be scheduled in the last 2 weeks of August, with the exceptions of August 21st, 22nd, and 28th. Is there, if someone wants to make that motion and get a second, we can then open up to public comment and then do a vote.
This is Karen Karp. I so move.
Thank you. Is there a second? Karen would be the first.
Joe Martin, I second the motion.
Joe Beachy, Sandra. So we'll do Joe as a second, and then we'll go ahead and open up to public comment. Thank you, board moderator.
The comment now, please refer to the screen share for members of the public to see how they should type in the request for comment. I've activated the question and answer feature. Members of the public can indicate that they would like to make a comment by typing into the question box, "I would like to make a comment." Please remember, you will have 2 minutes to make your comment. I will not give a reminder as your time approaches. I do not want to interrupt you nor cause you to lose your train of thought. I will mute your microphone and inform you that your time has expired, and we'll move on to the next member of the public. I'll pause for a moment for members of the public to type in, "I would like to make a comment." Board EO Melby, there are no public requests or comments on the WebEx. Are there any public requests or comments in Sacramento?
Public comments here in Sacramento.
Thank you. Would you like me to close this window?
Okay, we will do a roll call vote. The motion on the table is the last 2 weeks of August as a CRNA-AC meeting, with the exceptions of the 20th, 21st, and 28th. Sorry, and this 21st, 22nd, and 28th. Let me clarify on that. And there was a first and a second on that. And so then we'll go to Joe.
Joe Martin, yes.
Thank you. Karen?
Karen Karp, yes.
Kathleen?
Kathleen Theobald, yes.
Thank you. Sam?
Samantha Polakowski, yes.
And Sandra? Thank you. So we'll move on to the next agenda item. Okay, agenda item 7.0. Because this is a brand new advisory committee, we do establish them as our board was established after sunset back in about 2010, I believe what it was, so that we can have so we don't have everybody term out at the same time. So typical membership is 4 years, but there are going to be 2 people that would do a 3-year term. And so the way that is broken down is spelled out in the charter, that starts on page 14. And you will see that actually down on the top of page 15 for reference for you guys. So the public member is automatic 4 years. So that is established and set. So that's great. But what we do need to do is go through and touch bases with the 4 CRNAs of this committee. There will need to be 2 that volunteer to take a shorter term and 2 that volunteer to take a longer term. And so the shorter term is 3 years and the longer term is 4 years. And so if there are any preferences that you guys care to do, either a 4-year or a 3-year term, please let that be known at this point.
This is Karen Karp, and I would volunteer to take a shorter term if no one else has any preference.
Okay, thank you. And do we have anybody else that would want a 3-year term? Because then by default, the other 2 would be 4 years.
Sandra Bordy, I would prefer to do a 3-year term, please. Thank you.
Sounds great. So the motion on the table, if somebody would want to carry that through, would be that Karen and Sandra would both serve a 3-year term. The remaining CRNA members would do 4 years, as well as the public member. If somebody wants to make a motion, that would be great. Okay, do we have a second?
Kathleen, I second.
Perfect, thank you. Board moderator, can we go into public comment, please?
Public comment now. Please refer to the screen share for members of the public to see how they should type in their request for comment. I've activated the question and answer feature. Members of the public can indicate that they would like to make a comment by typing into the question box, "I would like to make a comment." Please remember, you will have 2 minutes to make your comment. I will not give a reminder as your time approaches. I do not want to interrupt you nor cause you to lose your train of thought. I will mute your microphone and inform you that your time has expired, and we'll move on to the next member of the public. I'll pause for a moment for members of the public to type in, "I would like to make a comment." Board EO Melby, there are no public requests for comments in the WebEx. Are there any requests for comments in Sacramento?
Nope, we do not have any comments here in Sacramento.
Thank you. Would you like me to close this window?
Yes, please. So we will go to a roll call vote. Reminder for Karen and Sandra to both be 3-year terms, the remainder CRNA, and public members to be at a 4-year term. Joe? Okay. Karen? Thank you.
Karen Karp, yes.
Okay, Kathleen.
Kathleen Theobald, yes.
Sam?
Yes.
And Sandra. Wonderful, thank you. We will move on to agenda item 8.0. This agenda item will not go as quickly as the others, unfortunately, because I know that this usually will take a lot of discussion. I do want to remind everybody that we do have 23 minutes left of this meeting. So it would be nice to get some subcommittees, if not all subcommittees, set forth. We are looking for at minimum 2 subcommittees to be formed. There could be a 3rd subcommittee formed as well, but it would have a single member of that subcommittee, not a secondary one, because you guys are a minimum of 5 and we couldn't have people overlapping on committees. So with that, we are looking at developing some subcommittees to work on updates for CRNAs, whether that be website updates, regulatory updates, whether that is anything that you guys have discovered as you guys have waited patiently for this to start for about a year. Go ahead and put any of the items out on the table for discussion. And if those items that you would like to start looking at as a subcommittee and you want to be a part of, you can let that be known at the same time. But remember, as Reza kind of talked about in previous agenda items, and I think I alluded to as well, is that subcommittees can only be made up of 2 people. There is an expectation that those subcommittees are focused and that work is completed and brought forth and presented to the entire committee for discussion and possible motion, or even information only if you're just giving an update and there's still more work to be done. So as all public stakeholders, as well as your co-advisory committees members can have input, maybe a redirection, maybe direction to say, hey, continue, you're doing an amazing job, we need more information, et cetera, can be done. So at this point, I'm going to open it up to you guys for you all to discuss different topics that you think might be appropriate for formation of at minimum 2 subcommittees, but I think we could also form a 3rd subcommittee if somebody wanted to go solo on that one. So thank you guys, and the floor is yours. don't all jump at once. Some of the items that I've heard people talking about is website cleanup. Our website is old, it is outdated. I am not trying to hide that at all. There is a lot of outdated stuff on there. It takes a village. So if you guys wanted to kind of start looking at that and going line by line through CRNA forms that are on there, any updates to those, that can be a subcommittee if they would want to start tackling that. Again, not required, but that is definitely a topic that has been brought forth to me. And then others is regulation. And I know that some of the things that Reza was talking about is we don't want underground regulations, and we would love to further kind of delineate anything in statute that we can so that we can have some clear guidance. Some of that could be our application process, right? Our application process right now is not in regulations, and so it does need to be added to regulations. We need to get language drafted on that. Academic programs, there is a statement in the statute, but we could even advance more into that. And if you guys really wanted to kind of take a look at the Title 16 regulations, you could take a look at Article 6 that is set forth for nurse midwives, as well as Article 8 for nurse practitioners. You can see that they are vastly different. Article 6 is fairly brief. There are a few regulations that are still on there, and one of them is 1460, which is just qualifications for certification. That could be something similar to what you guys would want to put out there and say, hey, what qualifies you to become certified as a midwife in the state of California? I do want to make sure that I clarify on certification. That causes a lot of angst with our stakeholders as well as our licensees, is the way that the BRN looks at it is your license is your RN license. Your certification is your advanced practice certification in California that allows you to work beyond the scope of an RN into the realm of medicine. And so I know that you guys have a separate national certification, and that causes some confusion when we're looking at board language, but that is the language that the board has adopted. And unfortunately, that does cause some confusion. So 1460 under nurse midwives kind of goes about what qualifies you for essentially licensure in California as a nurse midwife. That is something you guys can think of. They have some basic standards for nurse midwifery programs in 1462. 1463 kind of further delineates scope of practice. We are in the process of updating E in that one, where we would be removing at what they put as supervising physician deemed appropriate by using the standardized procedure, because we do understand that that does conflict with the statute now. And then the rest of it, you can see that it's been all repealed except for the renewal of certificates. So how do you get your license renewed? And so those could be topics that a committee could look at for developing regulations so that we have clear guidance on how to license nurse anesthetist in California. As of right now, we lack that. As you can see, there are no California Code of Regulations that address nurse anesthetists. Now, a more in-depth kind of process would be Article 8, and that would be nurse practitioners. Nurse practitioners, you can see, has several different items in there. They have 1480, which is definitions. They have 1481 that sets categories. You guys are nurse anesthetists, and you guys are not categorized out, so I don't know that that would be imperative for that. But they do also have the requirements for certification as a nurse practitioner, similar to nurse midwife, which you guys would need as nurse anesthetists. There is further explanation in there on what a 103 NP or 104 NP, as they have their pathways to independent practice. You guys do have a independent practice already. That could be something that you would want to have specifically stated in regulations. Right now, that is on your nurse anesthetist national and both California association statements, but I know that I get a lot of questions from legislators to explain how you guys have independent practice here in California. So that might be something that could be nice to truly have a steadfast reference point for. There is evaluation of credentials in the nurse practitioners, as well as requirements for nurse practitioner education programs, as well as nurse practitioner education changes to a program, and what is actually required to be educated on. They also delineate some scope of practice. They add in some information on out-of-state programs, and that might be something that if you guys are seeing kind of creep, where there's a lot of out-of-state CRNA programs coming into California and is causing displacement of in-state CRNA programs, you may want to address that in regulations, similar to what the nurse practitioner programs did. And then in 1487, they have a notice to consumers where they specifically state that they are a nurse practitioner and not a physician surgeon. That is similar to what is statutorily required for the nurse midwife. And I know that there's been a huge push lately within several different bills and federal laws about clearly defining who a nurse anesthetist is, and whether that is a nurse anesthesiologist, a nurse anesthetist, or anything that seems to be helpful, especially as you guys are kind of going through the process where there may be some stakeholders that say it is not clear that a nurse anesthetist, even though it says nurse anesthetist, is not a physician. And so that might be something that you would like to do as a notice, similar to what nurse practitioners have, as well as nurse midwives, so that there is no confusion to the public and ultimate patient safety at that point too. So those are some guidance as you guys go through this process that you may want to look at that's already in the books. Essentially, and you can look at what more of a minimal kind of regulatory update would be is with the nurse and midwives. A more extensive one, you could look at the nurse practitioners. But those are the two areas that we have definitely heard from stakeholders that we would love to have addressed. One would be regulatory updates, one would be website. So that would be two subcommittees if that's something that you're interested in. And you could even break that down further and have one work on regulations towards certification here in California and renewal, and you can have another one work on education standards or notice to consumers, or you can have somebody works on website. You can break it down, or you can do it more global. So those are some ideas to put out if anybody is interested in any of those.
And this is Reza. I'll just add, it may seem, like we're kind of throwing you into the deep end here, and that's very understandable. But just to remind you, you're being asked to kind of formulate the general topics, the topic with which each subcommittee will deal with, and you can choose to identify what are the highest priority things that need to be addressed first, or you can say, okay, well, this looks like an easy, discrete chunk that we can bite off and pretty quickly deal with early on. You can go about it that way. And Lori put out some examples of things, and you're not limited to those. And the nurse midwife regulations and the nurse practitioner regulations are also just by way of example to get you thinking about regulations. Those are not necessarily, the model that you need to follow. But yeah, so website is an example. Regulations is an example. You could have a committee looking at continuing education requirements if you wanted to, or something like that. But going back to like the regulations is often a big topic for subcommittees, because that's a big thing that our advisory committees lend their expertise to, is the development of regulations. And going back to a couple of things that were discussed early on, let me see if I can get it on screen. So hopefully you're able to see my screen here where I've got, so first of all, this chapter 6 is the Nursing Practice Act, starting with Business Professions Code, section 2700. And then within that is Article 7 for nurse anesthetists. And that's this set of statutes here, starting with section 2825. And the language that I read early on was this. It talking about in the certification and recertification process, the board shall consider the standards of this organization and may develop new standards if there is a public safety need for standards more stringent. So that's an area that if this committee decides there is a public safety need, you'd have to do so by way of regulations. And so one possible subcommittee could be looking into the current standards of the National Board of Certification and Recertification and look into, what are other commonly adopted standards, or just, based on practice, evidence, et cetera, is there a need for more stringent standards? So that's one topic that a subcommittee could take on, either have just a regulations subcommittee that deals with that, or a more specific committee that is more specifically dedicated to this topic. And then scrolling down a bit further, actually, I'll just pull up the specific section. So this is another section within that set of statutes, that Article 7. Sorry. Sorry, bear with me. That might not have been the one I intended to open.
It might have been, because that was the one where it talked about in a manner determined by the board
Okay.
on how they would demonstrate certification. So it said the certification shall be documented to the board in a manner to be determined by the board, and then proof of certification shall be filed within 6 months from the effective date of this article, et cetera. And so that is typically where we would see the application process. And so right now there's a BREEZE application that nurse anesthetists do. And the requirement right now is that all nurse anesthetists have national certification in order to come in and be licensed at the board. And then we do also look at your pre-licensure nursing education to get your RN, et cetera. And then we also get transcripts on every single topic that would be in your nurse anesthetist program to prove that you've gone there. Right now, that is not established in regulation. Right now, that is just an application that is on BREEZE, and you guys follow that. And so it is something that our board will have to do, is establish that in regulation. We would love to have your input on that as we go through that process, as to not have any unintended consequences and limit any CRNAs that could come into California that meet qualifications. Additionally, we would like to uphold public safety and public protection by ensuring that the appropriate applicants and what you guys would think is a good kind of metric that could be utilized. And you could even go so far as saying a nurse anesthetist could be licensed in California just based on their national certification, that they would not have to have transcripts showing that they have completed their nurse anesthetist training, because that is something that is done by primary documentation turned into the national certifying boards. And so that's a double, right? And so that could be something that you could choose, and that would mean on licensure. When we look at kind of forward looking on what's going on with the nation, and they're looking at the APRN compact, that might be something that may want to be addressed in regs that state something to the effect of where we're kind of aligning across the nation. So that might be an easier thing for you guys to join in the future. And so you would look at all of the other states' scope of practice, all of the other states' licensing and education requirements, and maybe set those forth in here if it's not explicitly spelled out, so that that would make it an easier transition if that ever gets established by legislation here in California. If not, though, at least your requirements are the same, and that would allow you guys for an easier reciprocity going into other states to practice. So those are things that you might want to consider as we're looking at that. But we do have to develop some regulations, at least, on how to get you guys licensed here and have that specifically set forth in law.
And the last thing I'll say is just once, if you're able to identify the general topics that you want for the focus of our subcommittees, we'll hopefully be able to assign specific members to the specific subcommittees. And then that allows those subcommittees to work on those topics between now and the next meeting in August. And before you really are diving deep into that, you'll have a chance, I think, to meet with Lori, myself, so we can really talk about and just kind of answer any questions you have about how the subcommittee will work and just get you going. So it's not that you're going to form a subcommittee today and you'll be out on your own in those subcommittees. We'll also have a chance offline to meet individually with the subcommittees and kind of steer you down the path of actually getting that work started.
Are you guys okay with establishing some subcommittee on regulation or website? Is that something you guys are considering? Do you have any other thoughts?
This is Karen Karp, and I have a question.
Yes.
There is a lot of work to be done with regulation and also probably legislation as well. Would it be possible to assign that work to a 3-person subcommittee? Would that be possible?
Could not. No, that violates the meeting. So it is two. Yeah,
you could
not focused on legislation necessarily at this point because that typically goes through an outside process. So the focus would be on regulation. And again, there is a lot of work, but what can be done is just methodically. You know, the first thing that you guys address would be how to get licensed in California, and then maybe not move anything past that, you know, and then maybe a different membership changes or whatever. You guys don't want to kind of shoulder that the entire time through. So we can break this down into very small, manageable portions and not be done by just the 2 people. Additionally, with those 2 people, you guys would be used mostly as subject matter expert, not necessarily as the drafter of regulation. We do have a regulatory attorney. He comes into those meetings with Reza, with myself, with Marissa, and through discussion with you guys and kind of the research or anything that you get from maybe your national certifying bodies already, we can take a look at that with your input on how to draft those regs too. So you're not doing it only, you're actually doing it as a member of about 6. So you have the 2 people as part of the subcommittee, myself, Marissa, Reza, and Stephen. And so together we are a 7-member subcommittee, kind of, just because we're here to support you guys in that process. But it really would be the 2 people.
And thank you all for doing that. I would like to volunteer for that committee, for the regulations committee.
Regulations, Karen. Okay. Is there another person?
Regulations? Yeah. To Karen's question, you could have, on the one hand, you could have a subcommittee that's simply identified as the regulations subcommittee, and they focus on whatever regulations are kind of the most highest priority or however you decide. On the other hand, you could have one subcommittee that's focusing on regulations in this particular area. For example, public safety and the standards of the national board. And then you could have another subcommittee focused on regulations dealing with the application process and the proof and all that the other thing I mentioned. So you could break down the regulations subcommittee really into 2 different subcommittees that kind of take their own discrete portion. So.
Or you can look at the website and help us in updating that and get a lot of the national CRNA kind of stuff adopted to California and as helpful guidance onto our web, because I know that there's not a lot on there for CRNAs, and what is on there is probably grossly outdated. So I do have one person that's interested in a regulatory subcommittee. Is there somebody that would love to work side by side with Karen?
Sandra Bordy, I would.
Sandra, got it. Thank you. And are we interested in doing a separate focused regulatory one, or do we have 2 people that would be interested in working with Macaulay and myself to update the website?
Samantha Polakowski, I would volunteer to help with the website.
Thank you, Sam. And is there a second person who would like to work closely with Sam? Kathleen?
Yes.
Thank you. And that leaves Joe. You're not doing anything. No, I'm joking. Joe, it would be up to you if there's something that you're interested in that you want to be a subcommittee as one, or
committee of the rules and regulation. If there's a subcommittee, if I understood that right.
There
I
is
agree
one
with
already
Karen.
on rules and regulations. Is there a specific topic of the regulation that you would like to target? And we can carve that out for you.
And this is new to me, so I'm not sure if this is regulation or legislation, but scope of practice, even defining what graduate means there, and some of the definitions that was brought up by Reza. I mean, there is a lot of work. I was on.
There is. Do you want to just start on definitions? And have that be your focus? Okay. So Joe would like to do regulations specific to definitions. Karen and Sandra, do you have any opposition to that?
No, none at all. No
Okay,
opposition.
you're like, please define away. Would
Lori,
love
to be
that.
clear, the definitions, what are we defining?
If you can bring up the one piece, I don't have it in front of me. Find it.
Let me,
The statute,
sure.
Reza, yeah.
Yeah,
I
so
have the PDF. I've shared it a ton of times, but one of them under the Nurse Anesthetist Act, there's Section E, graduate. It's very ill-defined. It's not very robust, and so when we start to
Correct.
use a graduate, there have been GRNAs, graduate registered nurse anesthesiologist, in some institutions and in other institutions, and there's nothing that defines that.
Yep.
We really need that defined so that the public can get access to healthcare, and so that institutions know what that means. Right now, it's up for interpretation.
so is this the one?
That is it. 28.6.
Okay, so to just reverting back to what I was saying, so the two areas where the statute kind of calls on the board to potentially pass regulations is this subdivision A, where it talks about the board shall consider the standards and determine if new standards are needed. That I think is a pretty meaty, pretty heavy topic. So it could be beneficial to dedicate one subcommittee to just that, rather than more broadly just regulations generally. So this, and I'm just throwing out ideas, but this could be one. And then I'll come back to this E. But the other one was the one we mentioned here.
And
Where
just,
was it? Lori,
you're looking for that
It's
Reza.
28:30.6.
Do a time check. We are 2 minutes past time right now, and I know that you guys are typically working and such too, and fitness into your day. So I do want to be mindful of that. We can leave it fairly broad at this point, Reza, and then help to define that more specifically. I just wanted to make sure that Joe is not working on the same things that Karen and Sandra are as we start the process. And so if he
I just
had
want to
something
ensure that if
specific-
we're setting him up for like a, to be looking into regulations, that it's something we have authority to implement regulations. And this other one that I've got on screen, 2830.6, is the other one I mentioned that it's kind of called out in statute that the board can identify the manner for documenting this, the certification.
So
that might be where his focus might land best, is kind of then you can explain what that documentation is. And so I think that might be more beneficial if that's helpful.
okay, much to think on. I don't have. I'm not going to comment right here, right now.
Yeah, we'll work with you on that one. And so yours would be on the certification process that's further down in statutes, and then Karen and Sandra would work on the more broader one up above together. And then if we have to define down further, we can, and make that public to everybody.
Committee looking at the requirement from 2830.6, and I think that's Joe. And then the other looking at 2826A, and that was, I think, Karen and Sandra.
Yeah.
And then Samantha and Kathleen on the website.
That's what we got. So if someone wants to make a motion, we can get a motion in a second and go out to public comment.
This is Kathleen. I'm making
Okay, so Kathleen's got a first and Karen's got a second. I'll grab you on that second one, Karen.
Thank
Board
you.
moderator, please go out to public comment.
Public comment now. Please refer to the screen share for members of the public to see how they should type in their request for comment. I've activated the question and answer feature. Members of the public can indicate they would like to make a comment by typing into the question box, "I would like to make a comment." Please remember, you will have 2 minutes to make your comments. I will not give a reminder as your time approaches. I do not want to interrupt you nor cause you to lose your train of thought. I will mute your microphone and inform you that your time has expired, and we'll move on to the next member of the public. I'll pause for a moment for members of the public to type in, "I would like to make a comment."
As we're waiting for public comment, I just want to make sure all the stakeholders and everybody on the call understands, as well as the advisor members, we will be posting these chair and vice chair, as well as with all the members, onto our website. And then we will also list you guys on there as the different subcommittees so that you have something to reference back, because we did move through this quite quickly.
Nailu Patel would like to make a comment. 1 second, please.
1 second here real quick. I'm just going to confer with board counsel. Nailu is our new board member. Is that acceptable for her to make public comment, Reza?
Give me a sec here.
Yep. I did say that she can participate as public and listen in, but I did not give her guidance toward public comment. So I just want to make sure that.
Sorry, yeah, it is a bit of a concern, and sorry, Nilu. We asked earlier if our advisory committee members can speak in a board meeting, and that, I think, we do have authority. And this is all coming from Bagley Keene, by the way. But that same section that I mentioned, section 11122.5, allows members of the board to attend a meeting of a standing committee of the board only as observers. So it doesn't work in the reverse way. The concern is if we had other board members or even listening later on the YouTube video of it, a communication being heard, discussed, or deliberated amongst board members, which we don't have a board meeting notice for today. Nilo, I apologize. And if you have questions or anything about that, or specifically whatever you wanted to discuss, I'd ask that you contact us offline.
Yeah, definitely. And she has really just said she wanted to thank. So I can do that and just say thank you guys for taking on this task. And we will make sure that this all gets reported out to our board. So appreciate that. There was also
thanks for your understanding, Neela.
Yep. And then there was one other public comment just to get the time and the date on. And Kathy Hughes, I don't have a date. We did not set a date specifically yet. So we just said the last 2 weeks of August, with the exception of the 21st, 22nd, and 28th. Those were no-goes on the date. So we'll get that out, and that will be posted public on our web as well, Kathy. Is there any other public comment or board moderator?
Nope, there are no other public request comments in the WebEx. Are there any public requests for comments in Sacramento?
Request for comments here in Sacramento.
Thank you. Would
Great.
you like me to close this window?
Please, yes. And I am rushing. I apologize because I want to be mindful of everybody's time. I'm going to do a quick roll call vote. And then as soon as this passes, we will adjourn. So Joe.
Yes.
Karen.
Karen Karp, yes.
Kathleen.
Kathleen Theobald, yes.
Sam.
Yes.
And Sandra. Awesome. So moved. So the final agenda item is adjournment. Thank you guys so much for your day today. I think we just have to have longer meetings. I think that's really what we're opening up here. I know that's hard to get into your schedules, but I think that's what we're really shining the light on here. So thank you. And we are adjourned at 12:38.